Good morning. We'd like to go ahead and get started now. I'm Jamie Van Ostrin, the director of the Center for Energy and Sustainable Development. I wanted to just introduce our first speaker, Charles Larry Harris, who's the chairman of the board of the Appalachian Stewardship Foundation, is the co-sponsor of the conference this year, along with the Center for Energy and Sustainable Development. So we thought we'd get this started off with Mr. Harris giving us some introductory remarks.
Thank you, Jamie, and welcome to all of you. It's a pleasure to see a good crowd here, still coming in, and we're right on time starting, which is 10 minutes late. But I'd like to begin by telling you a little bit about the Appalachian Stewardship Foundation. I suspect that many of you don't know about the history of it, so let's see if this works here. So, brief history of where we came from. Initially, there were a whole lot of groups that were trying to stop the Longview power plant from being built, and the reason was that we had already about 5 power plants within a 25-mile radius. But that process went forward, and eventually they got an air quality permit from the DEP. And at that time, 3 groups, Trout Unlimited here, and the council in the state, the Sierra Club, and the National Parks Conservation Association filed a formal appeal of the air permit. Within a very short time, Longview lawyers contacted us and asked if we could consider a settlement. And so we started meeting. The 3 groups hired a consultant, a person who was an expert on power plants, and she looked over the permit and made suggestions. And we also enlisted an environmental law firm, the Joe Lovett's group, to represent us. And as a result of this, we did come to a settlement. And the settlement is like the short version of the settlement for purposes here. Lowered emissions of both SO2 and the nitrogen oxides was one thing we accomplished. Lowered particulate emissions as well. The first mercury monitor in the U.S. on a coal-fired power plant. I don't know if there's any more now, but there are others. They all have them now. But this is the first. And the establishment of a mitigation fund and also the formation of a new 501c3 with board members from TU, the Sierra Club, NPCA, and Longview Power. So that was the settlement. And so we formed formally as a 501c3 in 2010. And our board members, I represent Trout Unlimited. William DiPaolo is here, and maybe you can wave his hand. He's sitting right back here. He represents the Sierra Club. And way in the back, so he can make a quick exit, perhaps, is Peter Kiefhaber, who represents the National Parks Conservation Association. Steve Nelson represents Longview Power, but he's not able to be here today. But Joe Douglas is right down here from Longview. So that's the group. And we have a very competent staff of one person. And that's Shonda Minnie, our executive director, who is, I know she's, way over here. She's also in the back for a quick exit. And along with Professor Van Nostrand, those are the two people who really put this together and did all the hard work for this conference. So we want to recognize that. So what sorts of things that do we do? I mean, I was a professor here at WVU and chased money my whole life, as we all do if we're in the academics. But this group is able to use the mitigation fund to fund worthwhile projects around the state. And when we started, I don't think there were many other funders that could fund the kind of things that we do. What do? Well, in general, we do projects that mitigate the energy development from whatever source that is. So one of our goals is to fund those projects that reduce greenhouse gases, for example, to reduce energy usage or get greater efficiency. And there's going to be a whole panel on that today talking about energy efficiency. We'd like to fund carbon sequestration projects. I don't think we've done much in the way of research, but lots of planting trees. And there's a few people in the audience that have gotten that funding here today. And stream restorations. I'm looking at the people that are involved here, and there are lots of good projects that we funded to restore streams that have been damaged by either acid mine drainage or acid rain or some other type of energy development. And then we fund many alternate energy projects. Solar installations probably is the main thing that we've been funding. So that's what we do. And that's us. And today we funded a couple of climate change, or we helped fund a couple of climate change conferences at Blackwater Falls. And I see Mr. Rod out here. And we got the idea, why don't we do something here today about energy and some of the ways of environmentally dealing with things. So just so we're all on the same page, and because I don't know if any of you saw the public TV on the NewsHour when the Clean Power Plan was revoked, they interviewed Gina McCarthy from the past administrator of the EPA. I don't know if you've seen that. And then Bob Murray of Murray Energy. Anybody see it? Somebody see it. Well, Gina McCarthy said pretty much what I'd expect her to say, since she's the co-author. But I was amazed by some of the things that Bob Murray said. So the three that I remember, he said that we're not really, there's no climate change crisis. The world is really cooling. And the ice caps are thicker than ever. And humans don't have anything to do with the climate change. It's just a natural cycle that the world is in. So I was kind of amazed by that and the politeness of the commentator. He didn't challenge anything that he said. So I thought I'd show a couple slides just to kick things off today, just to go see how right he was. the first one is just what is climate change, and see, does this got a, oh, no, that's got something I didn't want to do. Okay, I don't know if it's got a pointer, but what you can see here is that one aspect of climate change is the increased temperature over time. Back here, you see it's fairly stable until you get into the heat of the Industrial Revolution, when we started burning a lot of fossil fuels, and then you see the temperature continue to rise. And that's one aspect of the climate change. What causes it? Well, I think most climatologists and climate scientists would agree that the increased temperature, which you see is the orange line, and by the way, I got this, the data I'm showing off the EPA website. It's from a 2016 climate change report. I don't know if it's still there, but I got it a while ago before maybe it was removed. And so it was not only the EPA, but 25 universities were involved, and I think 4 other federal agencies in getting this data, just so you know where it came from. So what you see here is increased temperature, again in orange, and then the yellow line represents the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere, now above 400 parts per million. I'm sorry. Did you all hear me in the back or not? Okay, so increased levels of CO2 are correlated, therefore, with climate change. I wish I had a longer arm, I could point better, but thanks for pointing that out. And then the other thing about these cycles, this is some data. I mean, the people who did this report don't know how to make graphics. It's too busy, you know, can't read it, but it's a simple message here. Going over to the far left, you see there's in the purple is the CO2 levels that they got from ice core samples back 800,000 years into the ice ages. And you can see that, yeah, CO2 goes up and down in cycles. It's true. And when you get into the light blue colors, that's past the ice age. You see it continues to go up and down. And it was going up, and then in orange is when the Industrial Revolution started. And now it goes sky high. And so, yeah, there are cycles, but we're at historically much higher levels of CO2 than ever before. So I don't think that, I think it's clear. Let's not say anymore. And then this slide shows what's called temperature anomalies, which means that if you look at the far left in the period of 1950 to 1980, temperatures in blue are cooler than the normal, in red, hotter than normal, and those days, therefore, are about even. As you can see with the white in the middle are the normal temperature days. And they follow what any mathematician would call a normal distribution. As you move through the 80s and 90s and up to 2000, can you see that there's a shift? And there's many more hot days and fewer cooler days, and still also fewer normal days. And into the 2000s and up to the last decade, it's got even more extreme. So I don't think the Earth is really cooling off, as he said. And this is just some of the indicators of climate change. There are others. We have warming and acidification of the ocean. So as the ocean gets warmer, picks up more CO2, and therefore acidifies, and that's causing loss of species and loss of diversity and so on. We're seeing increased storm intensities. It's difficult scientifically to look at just one year, but look at the year we've had this year with damage in Texas and Florida and the Caribbean. Horrible things are going on with stronger hurricanes. We see flooding in some areas. The Northeast, for example, has had a lot of flooding over the last 10 years, and droughts in other areas. The Southeast had a big drought. We're in a drought right now, and so you're going to see extremes of temperature of these kinds of things as we continue through the climate change era. Some forests have dried out, and that leads to a lot of wildfires. And I like to go out fishing in the West, and this year they had horrible fires. Didn't go, not for that reason, but lots of people have had trouble because of the fires out there. You get increases in invasive species. Since I just mentioned western forests, I'll just say that there's a pine beetle that has killed, in some areas, like in northern Colorado, 90% of the forest is dead. I was there, I saw it. Green hills? No. Brown hills from all the dead trees. And this is also because we have warmer winters. They don't die off as much, so they're increasing. There's an early snow melt-off. The glaciers are receding all over the world. You have the mountains losing their snow earlier because of the warmer temperatures, and that, from my perspective, hurts my trout streams. So, but it does other things as well. So that's my climate change talk. And today, we're not necessarily just talking about climate change. You all have the program, so you can see the panels are around the energy future for West Virginia, and also some environmental discussions as well. And alternate energy is a part of it. So I thought I would share with you, as my last slide, one of my favorite philosophers. And I don't know if you can read this in the back, but here's Lucy and Linus says, "Stand real still, and feel the warm sun on your back." Doesn't that feel great? And it's free. So thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harris. I'm really pleased to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Brian Anderson. He's the head of the West Virginia University Energy Institute. He's also the GE Plastics Materials Engineering Professor in Chemical Engineering here at WVU. The Energy Institute, as you might know, is the central university organization. They keep us all coordinated in terms of both fossil energy, sustainable energy, energy policy, and environmental stewardship related to energy. We've asked Brian to give an overview of the demands of the new energy economy. Thanks, Dr. Anderson.
Jamie, thank you. And Charles, thank you very much for the intro talk on climate change and the ramifications that we are seeing due to our past energy economy. And that leads right into what are the demands on our future energy economy. In particular, when we think of trying to get energy to a developing world where there are still billions of people without power and clean water, and reliability issues in places like Puerto Rico when storms come through. And as we've seen in the news, there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of sun in Puerto Rico, and perhaps there's a better alternative for the existing grid that they have that leads to more reliability. And so there are a lot of challenges domestically within the state of West Virginia and internationally to try to support 7 billion people and moving upwards toward 10 billion people on the planet, feeding them and providing the energy that they demand to try to have a quality of life like we enjoy in the developed world. And so the demands of this new energy economy, I'm going to really focus more on what's the future of West Virginia and how within our state we have been dependent on the coal industry for the base of our jobs for the better part of a century, and that is changing, and that is changing due to the entirety of the energy sector. And so, as Jamie mentioned, we at the Energy Institute have 4 major pillars on campus that we are focused on in the research space, and that is in clean, low-carbon fossil energy, and I'll get into that. That is in sustainable energy, and I don't have a slide on it, but exciting, on Monday we have a kickoff meeting with the Department of Energy on a geothermal project here on campus. There's an engineering feasibility to convert our what is currently our steam that's provided from a coal-burning power plant on Beechhurst Avenue, but convert that over to heating our campus and cooling our campus using deep geothermal. And that project's in partnership with the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, the West Virginia Geologic and Economic Survey, WVU, and Cornell University. And we're really excited about the potential of bringing geothermal out of the western United States and into the east. We also have in the sustainable energy area a lot of work going on in biofuels, and I have, our images here are indicative, and it was the big middle button. But the images here, we are working very well, and I can't really see where it is anyway. It's a tiny, tiny little dot. But this is a picture of the Neskavidler power plant and geothermal power plant in Iceland, which we are trying to replicate here in Morgantown, West Virginia. Growing biofuels, biocrops on reclaimed mine lands, work by Jeff Skousen and others in the Davis College of Agriculture here at the university, and how we can take brownfields and mine lands and convert them into biocrop areas. We also have a keystone project in the Department of Energy called the Marcellus Shale Energy and Environment Laboratory, which is the most instrumented natural gas well in the world in terms of measuring the environmental footprint, every drop of water, every drop of chemical that went on-site or off-site, as well as emissions monitoring done by the National Energy Technology Lab within the DOE and WVU, both School of Public Health and Civil Engineering. We measured everything that went on at this site, including water, and are working very closely with the Department of Energy on how to minimize the environmental footprint of the next generation of shale resources. So all of that is a context of the Energy Institute. We launched 3 years ago, specifically under new leadership of E. Gordon Gee, our president here at WVU, where we as a land-grant institution want to re-envision our role within the state. The Wall Street Journal a few years ago came out with a list of the most influential organization in all 50 states. In the state of Washington, it was Microsoft, and in California, I believe it was Google. In West Virginia, it was WVU, and we were the only university on that list. And what that means is not only are we the largest employer in the state of West Virginia, but we have a mandate to help the state look for its future. And so that's what we're embarking on, is trying to envision what that future would look like, where it is a robust economy, where we have jobs for the people, we can get folks off of the opioid epidemic, and the best way to do that is to provide hope and jobs. And you'll hear this afternoon from the American Jobs Council on their take on this as well. And so we have three major goals: is to expand our research portfolio to about $60 million annually by 2025, and we have increased our energy research expenditures in the last 3 years by 48%. We are now $25 million a year, but we're growing that. To promote development in the state of West Virginia and do it sustainably, and sustainably in all aspects, meaning it's a sustainable economy, it's a sustainable environment, and it's sustainable development. And to elevate our workforce, because without an elevated workforce, we will not expand our economy. So we have a lot of major initiatives and partnerships across the university, including in natural gas utilization. How can we utilize the natural gas resource we have, both responsibly from a development standpoint, but then also in the downstream as we create new recyclable, biodegradable plastics from the ethane that comes from the ground. In coal utilization, we run in partnership with the U.S. Department of Energy, and Sarah Forbes you'll hear from here on the next panel, the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center Advanced Coal Technology Consortium, which is now in its 7th year, is a partnership between the U.S. and China in developing and commercializing technologies to minimize the CO2 footprint of coal production. And I will tell you, I'm glad Longview's here in the room, because if you don't know that the most energy efficient coal burning power plant in the Western Hemisphere is 6 miles north of us here is Longview Power, as the lowest heat rate, meaning it burns the least amount of coal per megawatt hour in this hemisphere. There are a couple plants in China that beat it because they have had a concerted research effort on advancing technologies and advanced materials, but that's why we partner with them in commercializing these technologies, so we can lower the footprint of coal production. We also work a lot in carbon capture and sequestration, as well as other carbon mitigating techniques like next generation combustion technologies such as chemical looping combustion, where you use an oxidant on a solid material instead of an air, and it makes it a heck of a lot easier to separate the CO2 on the backside. We are active in developing some sustainable energy pathways with some partnerships with the Nature Conservancy, as well as the US DOE's Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Program, not just the geothermal program, but in advanced manufacturing. We're playing a major role in 2 manufacturing hubs that are both $70 million DOE programs with $140 million of cost share from industry, specifically targeted to lowering increasing the efficiency of manufacturing, lowering the footprint. And so, just quickly, I want to highlight a program that WVU, Marshall University, and the West Virginia Department of Commerce has embarked on so far this year. It's called West Virginia Forward. And this, we engaged an outside consulting group to come in and work with us hand in hand over a long period of time to try to chart a path forward for the state of West Virginia. And just a quick summary, we're focused on understanding the strengths that the state has and the opportunities that are moving forward, and to try to create initiatives that will provide long and short-term successes in revitalizing our economy and looking forward, and that is the key. And so it all comes down to implementation. We can identify different economic sectors and economic enablers, and I know this is an eye chart. I don't know if we're sharing the slides, but these are available if you go to West Virginia. If you Google WV Forward, you can find all of this information. But what we found is that for economic development, we need to both diversify our economic sectors instead of being reliant on large single entity types of industry sectors like coal, and diversify our economy, as well as improving performance indicators such as the workforce, the drug-free workforce, and the educated workforce in the state of West Virginia. And so these economic enablers, they come down to the business climate in which businesses operate in West Virginia, innovation and business development, infrastructure, and human capital. And what I want you to take away from this slide is blue means we outperform our peers, yellow means we're on par with our peers, and red means we underperform. And so how are we doing in the state of West Virginia? We've got one blue one. And so there's a lot of room for improvement. There are some really good opportunities and ideas for us to move forward. And so where we do overperform our peers is in the cost of doing business. But we need to increase our human capital and our infrastructure, and that's exactly the types of initiatives that we're working on. So the value proposition comes down to the cost of doing business, and we do have one of the lowest employee turnover rates in the country. We have a loyal workforce that's very attractive to industry. We have a high home ownership rate, which goes hand in hand with that. The earnings per hour is on the low end, which means it doesn't cost businesses that much to employ our folks. And that's because the cost of business, or the cost of living, and the cost of doing business is lower than all of our peers. And in fact, we have a business climate that is better than our peer states in the close region. And so now to move on to the economic sectors that we're targeting. And they all do come down to the raw materials and the resources, the human resources we have in the state. And one is in carbon fiber reinforced plastics. If you don't know what a CFRP is, it is the graphite shaft of a driver, or if you have a graphite bicycle, that is one example of a carbon fiber reinforced plastic. But you can take those materials and lightweight vehicles. You can revitalize bridge surfaces and bridge decks, and you can even make rebar that doesn't rust, that is stronger than steel yet lighter than steel. And so we are creating a cluster area specifically in this, and WVU actually has some intellectual property that we're working on commercializing to get out there and get into our roads and bridges in the near term. Another area is in fine chemicals, because of the raw materials that we are blessed with and how we can use them more efficiently. The third is in higher-end tourism, and the fourth is in cybersecurity. And so some of the infrastructure that we need is in the state. We don't have that much good industrial sites. And so we're trying to learn from our peers and how we can certify sites to bring and attract business. And what this includes is brownfields redevelopment. It includes taking sites and remediating them and bringing them up to spec. And so our implementation structure is an MOU between WVU, the Commerce Department, and Marshall, and we're creating a structure of accountability with a steering committee that's across the state and have 4 different implementation working groups, the first of which is energy. And I know I did only have 15 minutes. We started a little bit late, but I want to bring now down to we all know that there is a shale gas boom in the region, and how can we do that? How can we take advantage of that sustainably, yet make sure that we provide the opportunities that are moving forward? And so we know that the natural gas production in the United States used to be in the South and Gulf Coast, but over the last 10 years, all of the growth in natural gas production has happened here in the Northeast, in the Marcellus. And because of that, our fuel mix of electricity production has changed. And what I'm showing here is national generation of electricity is no longer majority in coal. It is now the majority in natural gas. It flipped a little bit this year because in the West they had a really good rain year and some really good hydro in the Pacific Northwest, and they scaled back some of the natural gas production, which allowed coal for a brief period of time to overtake natural gas. But here in the Eastern Interconnect and PJM, which West Virginia is the only regulated state, fully regulated state in PJM, we have seen a tremendous market change in the capacity market for electricity production in PJM. We see that gas has come on. If we look at capacity markets, work 3 years out. It's the capacity you're going to have in 3 years. And we see that in 3 years from now, natural gas will be the dominant electricity production. All of the capacity additions in PJM have been in natural gas, either combined cycle or gas turbine. And so we see now with this huge flux of natural gas coming out of the region that our neighbors are wanting more natural gas too, Virginia, North Carolina, Ohio. And so we see a tremendous amount of infrastructure being built. Many of it's controversial. We won't get into it. Between the Rover Pipeline, Atlantic Coast Pipeline, Mountain Valley Pipeline, and what that is doing is creating more demand in the region to suck the natural gas out. Well, what happens is, along with the natural gas, with the methane, is about 15% ethane. And if you burn ethane, just as a note, if you burn ethane, it does have a higher CO2 footprint than methane. So much so that right now, in the Marcellus, we are rejecting, quote unquote, rejecting about 250,000 barrels a day of ethane because we have nothing to do with it. We can't make plastics out of it because we can't get it to markets. When you burn 250,000 barrels a day of ethane, that's about 3 million tons per year of CO2 more than if you were burning the equivalent amount of methane for the same amount of BTUs. And so we're embarking on a project now to try to get that ethane off of the natural gas system and get it into consumer products. And that is something called the Appalachian Storage Hub that we're working on in conjunction with the states of West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Kentucky. And so if we look at the ethane that's projected to come out of the Marcellus, the big bar I want you to see is the big orange bar at the top. And that's the ethane that's going to be burned. It's in your furnaces, it's in our power plants, unless we make consumer goods out of that very valuable ethane. And so the American Chemistry Council has estimated if we're able to take advantage of that big orange bar in this region, we can create 101,000 jobs, $36 billion of financial investment, of capital investment in the region, an annual local and state tax revenue of $1.7 billion to the 4-state region, and federal taxes of what is it, $1.2 billion. And so what we would make out of this is carpets and food packaging and pipes and siding and light-weighted carbon fiber reinforced plastics for vehicles to help the automobile supply chain lightweight their vehicles. And so there's a tremendous opportunity in manufacturing when we have all of the natural gas and natural gas liquids in the region. And so 2 years ago and 7 days, the 3 governors of West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Ohio signed an agreement here in Morgantown to work together to capitalize on this opportunity. And that comes down to the Appalachian Storage Hub natural gas, Appalachian Storage Hub natural gas liquid storage study that was led by a group out of WVU in partnership with the Geologic Surveys of West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. Mike Hahn, the director of the Geologic Survey in West Virginia, is here in the room, and his team really led on trying to identify the opportunities to take natural gas liquids and create a storage and trading hub. And there are 3 different types of storage opportunities. You can do it in limestone, you can do it in sandstone, and you can do it in salts. And as it turns out, the state of West Virginia is very well blessed, much like the state of Texas, to create geologically a storage and trading hub. And the reason trading is important is because what that does is it allows the industry to see a transparent market. They can buy it off the spot market. Right now, there are 2 people in the region who know how much you can buy ethane for, and that's not one that's conducive to bringing in industry. And so in summary, with the storage hub summary, the abundance of natural gas and natural gas liquids in the region is certainly an opportunity that we have to be very careful in moving forward. There are 2 pathways economically in the free market. One pathway is to build offtake pipeline to take it to Philadelphia and take it to the U.S. Gulf Coast, or use it within the region. And so those 2 economic pathways end up in 2 different end states. The end states for the country are, if we expand petrochemical operations on the U.S. Gulf Coast and in Philadelphia, then when we have Hurricane Harvey run through, we have even bigger of a perturbation to our national GDP when they have to shut down 61% of the U.S. cracking capacity that makes our polyethylene, that makes the seats and the fibers that you're sitting in on the cushions of your seats. When Hurricane Harvey went through, there are still crackers that are down today and will be through the end of the year, which means that there are manufacturers in the region that cannot get their polyethylene resin today because there is an undersupply. And so if we create the pathway where a petrochemical industry ends up in this region, we have the opportunity to put on new and best available technologies and create the new generation of the petrochemical industry. And now back to an early point I made about the National Network of Manufacturing Institutes and our partnership with the U.S. Department of Energy is that both of those manufacturing institutes are focused on smart manufacturing and high-intensity process intensification so that we reduce the impact of the petrochemical industry when it's built again. And so that's, we have a very strong partnership on this project with the Department of Energy. Secretary Rick Perry is a great proponent, even was talking about this project in Philadelphia on Monday this week. We are working hand in hand with creating a blueprint for how we can do, how we can build a petrochemical hub in this region, but do it sustainably and do it with the best next generation technologies. And so to run some economics, if we make ethane here, if we produce ethane from the ground here, it takes about 15 to 16 cents to ship it to the U.S. Gulf Coast, where it's sold this year. The average is 24 3/4 cents per gallon. And so that means that producers here are getting 11 cents when it's sold for 25 cents in the Gulf. What that means is there is a huge driver, economic driver, for this build-out to happen. But also one thing that you can't understate is that 70% of the plastics demand in the United States is here in the Northeast. So what happens to that ethane we ship down there is it's turned into resins, put on rail or trucks or barges and shipped back to the Northeast. And there's a lot of dead weight transportation loss, a lot of emissions on the road that is absolutely unnecessary if we put the production, put the manufacturing closer to the end users. And so all of this is part of our West Virginia Forward Plan, and I know I went way too long, I'm sorry, Jamie, but I just get excited. But it's part of our West Virginia plan about how we can at least start thinking about formulating a path forward. And I know I didn't get into all the initiatives. We have 167 faculty member affiliates at the university, all working on really exciting projects. And so I feel very unfortunate to only be able to highlight a couple of the things we're doing. But I know you'll hear about some of them today, and I applaud Jamie and the Center for Energy and Sustainable Development here at the law school and the efforts that they're doing in putting this together today. And thanks for your attention. Maybe we have time for some questions. I don't know. Any questions for Brian? Yeah. There's one here and then there. So in terms of the funding, the internal funding at WVU that we spend, I have a very generous donation from a family estate called the O'Brien Energy Fund, and that is about 50% sustainable and 50% fossil, and the 50% fossil includes a major program we have in rare earth elements, which is actually not fossil, because what you use rare earths for is for permanent magnets in wind turbines and things like that. So that's probably a little bit of a misnomer, but we're extracting the rare earths from acid mine drainage. And so it's actually an extremely exciting project. We have acid mine drainage sludge throughout the northern Appalachian coal fields, and they're a tremendous source for rare earths that can be used in the renewable sector. So that's the internal funding. Now, external funding, of the 167 faculty, many of them go out and get fossil energy funding from the Department of Energy, to where that ratio is closer to 75% of our external funding from the DOE comes in the fossil space. However, one should note that any project with the Department of Energy and fossil is specifically targeted to mitigating the effects of CO2 as emissions from fossil. I mean, that's the whole mission. And so if you compare us to University of Texas at Austin, who gets a lot of industry funding, you know, we get a pittance of industry funding, actually. Yeah, and here and then.
You mentioned biofuels.
Mm-hmm.
I'm involved with the airline industry.
Yep.
You know that the large Australian airline just announced they're going to fly from Australia to Los Angeles on biofuels.
The Qantas, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Qantas, yeah, joining Virgin Atlantic and Lufthansa, who are already on biofuels.
Yeah.
But I'd like to ask you, are you looking in at all to cellulosic fiber to replace carbon fiber?
As a matter of fact, we are. So we have one of our seed projects under the O'Brien funds is specifically targeted toward using biomass and biomass waste from pulp and paper mills and the like, to then use that as replacement for carbon fibers and carbon products. And so we're working with NASA on that particular project. In the biofuel space, in the Davis College, led by Professor Jinxing Wang, we have a lot of work in woody biomass, because the resource we're blessed with in West Virginia is largely woody lignocellulosic material, beyond cellulosic. And so a lot of our work is in converting the lignocellulosic material into biofuels. And you can do it, there's biofuels, but then there's also using the biomass directly for heat, so through torrefaction, where you basically create something that looks like a coal, but you make it from biomass, and you can use that in co-firing, and we have active research in those areas, as well as biomass gasification, where you take biomass and you gasify it, you break it down into its smallest elements, mostly syngas, which is hydrogen and carbon monoxide, and then you can use that as a fuel. And so we have a lot of work going on those too.
And then in your diversification of the economy, are you focusing at all on the composites manufacturing industry?
Yes, and actually the carbon fiber reinforced plastic is a composite, but then we also have wood plastic composite work a lot. Rakesh Gupta and chemical engineering has done a lot of work in that area. And then I want to get to, there was one last question. Yeah.
Tom?
Real quick.
Yeah. On the question of the ethane storage hub that you were explaining about,
Mhm.
I'm not quite clear whether you're seeing that as something that seems to be very much in the cards and just a natural association with the development of Marcellus, of the shale and gas in West Virginia. And if that's so, with no significant obstacles. On the other hand, is this something that's a possibility, but there are really some obstacles here because of economic competition or whatever? And if there are obstacles to it, what are those obstacles as you see them?
Well, one is just capital. So it would take to build out, so the storage and trading hub, there's storage containers, but there's also a lot of pipeline that connects industrial sites. And so we're talking an investment on the order of $6 to $8 billion. And so there's certainly a capital hurdle, a large capital hurdle there. And there's some competing markets. But it is something that is actively moving forward under a 4-state cooperation. And so we have Kentucky, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia all working together to try to create the strategy for how to move this forward, move it forward in a public-private partnership manner so that we can have some oversight and then hand it off into the private sector. And so it's something that's moving forward, but it would not move forward without a concerted effort. But we have the concerted effort going on. So, yeah. Well, thank you.
Brian's mention of biomass and potentially co-firing biomass with coal is a nice segue to our next panel. I want to introduce Dr. Amy Curtright, who's the moderator of this panel. She's a senior physical scientist based in Pittsburgh at the RAND Corporation. Amy was at our conference in February of 2014 that looked at clean coal technologies and actually did a talk on possibility of co-firing biomass with coal. So if we could have the panelists that on this panel with Amy Curtright, we got Thomas Minnie, Professor Pat McGinley, and Sarah Forbes. So take it away, Amy. Thank you. We'll just play it, see how it goes.
Great. All right, well, thank you very much. Thanks to organizers of this conference. It's really great lineup and some really important content we're going to cover today. So this first panel is taking a look at the opportunity to take advantage of a low-carbon economy. So I think this has already come up this morning, but I think it's worth restating that this conference, as well as any serious conversation about the future of energy, has to start from a common understanding that we can't keep doing things the way we've been doing them. That's just full stop. So if we want to deal with things like our carbon problem, we're going to have to do them differently. And for a state like West Virginia that has had such a history of relying on and benefiting from fossil fuels and paying the consequences of using fossil fuels, that means that there is a challenge to all of you, challenge to industry, to do things differently. The flip side of challenge is it's an opportunity for innovation and for new things. And this panel covers some aspects of thinking about the tried and true resources and using them in new, innovative, less environmentally negative ways. So I'm not going to read the bios of the folks on the panel because it'll just eat into our time. Please take a look at the website to see those bios. We're going to start with Thomas Minnie this morning from the Nature Conservancy, and then I'll suggest we'll go next to Sarah Forbes from Department of Energy, and we'll end up with Patrick McGinley from West Virginia University. Does that work for everybody? Great.
Works for me.
Take it away.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm Thomas Minnie. I'm the State Director of the Nature Conservancy here in West Virginia. I've been working with the Nature Conservancy for the past 17 years in multiple roles, but in West Virginia, but also working both regionally and globally for the Nature Conservancy. So, the theme of this panel is the low-carbon future. And it's kind of a misnomer for my presentation because I'm going to talk a lot about the fact that we've got lots of carbon here in West Virginia. We've been a carbon-based economy. We've been monetizing carbon for a long time, and we've often discussing what monetizing carbon does to us in terms of the emissions, in terms of the impacts that we have from fossil fuels, from coal, from natural gas, and others. But I'm going to kind of try to flip things on its head this morning and talk about what you wouldn't expect from the Nature Conservancy, but monetizing things, but this time carbon again, but the opportunities that we have relative to forest carbon in West Virginia. And, when we think about monetizing carbon in the past, we talked a lot about economic growth, we talked about job creation and financial security. But I want to put this in the realm with the forest carbon markets that, the co-benefits that we get out of this relative to climate action, water stewardship, biodiversity protection are rolled into this monetization process. So I just wanted to take a start at this with looking at, the whole equation of natural climate solutions. So this is our tag for those activities that we can put into place that have those co-benefits. We looked at the fact that right now, in 2030, our scientists estimate that 30% of global carbon emissions could be sequestered by our forests, farms, and ecosystems if we focus on a management system to really be able to achieve those goals. And in a just released report about 2 weeks ago, the Nature Conservancy's, where I'm pulling these slides from, we looked at where we are right now. So if we look at emissions, right now we're at about 14% of U.S. emissions are ameliorated by what carbon the forests can absorb. But if you look over time and how we're going to offset the carbon impacts that we're seeing, these natural climate solutions can even play a larger role if we focus on building those out. So within this report, we looked at where are the major gains that could be had through we identified 20 pathways for being able to do these carbon mitigation practices. And as you can see, you'll see at the top of the list, forests is right there at the top. And there's two major bars there that are really important. That's the reforestation and also the forest management, where we can see real gains in the types of offsets that we can get from forest carbon. So many of you are aware of the forest carbon markets, but I just want to cover some fundamentals about the forest carbon market. So there's two ways that you can get forest carbon credit and see cash flows from the forest carbon markets. First is the voluntary markets. These are companies that just step up and decide that they're going to pay for forest carbon as part of their corporate responsibility. And then there are the compliance markets, which are the regulatory markets. And right now, the main regulatory market that's functional is the California market. So this is where we can go to find buyers that are looking for those carbon credits. So just keep that in mind. So what's the size and scale of the opportunity? So 45% of Fortune 500 and 64% of Fortune 100 companies have climate change or clean energy targets. This means these companies are already aligned to thinking of what they can do, how they can add benefit to lowering carbon emissions and offsetting the impacts that are being made by those. And many of those targets that these companies are setting out are being met through buying carbon credits. So there's been over $1 billion spent on the voluntary carbon market offsets in the past 10 years. And then in last year, the California compliance market invested $63 million in U.S. forests. So what we're finding, we're working on this, and we'll talk more about it in a minute for the Nature Conservancy's forest carbon programs. We are actually getting more demand than we can provide projects into the pathway of. So how does this impact West Virginia? So, we've been talking about West Virginia as a carbon state for a long time, and we've been focused underground on what the amount of carbon that we have here and how we can monetize that carbon. But West Virginia has a leading place from a national, and even if you compare globally, when you think about the fact that there's a lot of carbon sequestered in these amazing forests that we have here in West Virginia. So other than a few spots in California and the Pacific Northwest, our forests can sequester more carbon than most anywhere here in this country. And we have an advantage that we should be focusing on, and that's that we have low land costs and our opportunity costs, which make investments for forest carbon here even more viable. Payments to sequester more carbon in forests are much more likely to be attractive to landowners in a place where timber prices are low and there's little pressure to develop the land. People are looking for additional revenue streams right now, so there's some incentive to get people engaged in these programs. And, we get co-benefits from investing in forest carbon in West Virginia. Those same big green blobs that kind of indicate the amount of standing carbon that we have here are the same big green blobs that we love to go stand on at the top of Dolly Sods or in the Cranberry that are attracting people here to lay out tourist dollars and other investment dollars. So when we think of quality of life benefits and how we can build that argument as we go forward, this also supports that dialogue. So I would guess one takeaway message here for us in West Virginia when we see this map and our standing in is, when or if there's a national dialogue around federal climate change legislation in the future, we should be poised and ready to argue heavily for the inclusion of forest carbon in that legislation. It's a natural pathway for increasing an economic revenue stream for West Virginia. Before the climate agreement was set aside, we got really excited because in COP21, avoided deforestation or afforestation in areas could have gotten credit for moving things forward, and that seemed like it was a real driver for West Virginia. So how do we get back in that seat into the future? So I want to nail down and focus in on then some work that we're doing relative to following some of these pathways to both monetize and see that sequestration happen. So one of those goals that we have then is focusing, on the avoided forests and the natural forest management focus of those pathways. And we have a program in the Nature Conservancy that's working here in the Appalachians that I'm going to focus on called the Working Woodlands Program. And what our Working Woodlands Program does, it's a TNC program focused on matching forest carbon income to private landowners to bring forest tracts into long-term management for forest carbon sequestration. And as you can see, this achieves multiple goals. It achieves forest protection. It gets certified forest management on the landscape here in West Virginia. And we see ecosystem benefits from those monetizations. We see the carbon credits there, but also there's co-benefits around water and other things. So how does the Working Woodlands program work? So in exchange for a permanent working conservation easement, TNC provides the landowner at no cost with a high-quality forest inventory and plan. We put that into the FSC certification under the TNC group certificate. We bring high-quality market access to the carbon credits. The relationships that we have with the carbon credit companies is very robust. And we also provide ongoing technical support from the TNC staff. And ultimately, the goal that really attracts people is this provides a long-term cash flow for the sale of timber, pulpwood, and other carbon credits. So, currently we have not been implementing the Working Woodlands program in West Virginia. It's a goal of the West Virginia chapter to begin to be implementing these projects. We have tremendous opportunity here, but just for a couple of examples, in Pennsylvania we've done several projects, and we've done projects in Tennessee, New York, and in Michigan. We also have programs in the Mississippi River area where we've been also matching credits there for the Mississippi River bottom forests. So we've facilitated $6 million in sales of carbon offsets for the working woodland landowners, and working on these projects, just the projects that we have in the pipeline could match up another $20 million in sales. So a real catalyst for getting those projects done. So just delve in a little bit now into some of the work that we're doing that focuses on, the reforestation side of the equation to be able to sequester those projects. So this is not just a TNC project. This is a project of many people in the room and many funders in the room. So I think that we can all share this. The Central Appalachian Spruce Restoration Initiative was sort of a first foray that started about 10 years ago, where we were thinking about, we have these large sites in West Virginia, mine lands in the Monongahela National Forest, and the red spruce forest, which is so important. So how do we start thinking about putting this in a place where it's not only doing restoration for the sake of the forest, but it's doing restoration at small-scale economic benefit? And so you can see the partners that came together on this, and so far we've done, we're just about to plant the 1,000,000th red spruce tree next year through the Central Appalachian Spruce Restoration Initiative to restore. Yeah, that's a good thing, right? So, and everybody on that list has contributed deeply in many ways to make this happen. And in addition, we've seen, I think it's about 3,000 acres now of mine lands on the Upper Shavers Fork that have been planted in red spruce trees. So we're going to see that reforestation grow. So this is the beginning of a conversation. How does reforestation, how does putting these small economies around restoration begin to emerge? How do we bring the partnerships together to do that? I think we have a first step. But let's think about that in the context of West Virginia. So if you look at that map, we saw those big, nice, intact forest maps earlier that's driving that above-ground carbon. Well, interspersed in that, over there by Interstate 64, you can see are those white spots are the large-scale mining sites that we have in West Virginia. In the Appalachians, there's just over 1 million acres of land, of open land available for forest restoration. That doesn't mean it's all tagged for forest restoration, but it's the amount of trees and stems that could be put in the ground on those sites could sequester quite a bit of carbon. And in addition, if we think about the restoration economy, these areas are coinciding with those areas that are probably going to need the most effort to put people back to work, people that can drive the D9s, bulldozers that do the work that we need to have done to be able to prepare the sites, those sort of things. So I would just put that out there too, that, every conversation that I'm in lately, whether it's here or any other conference, we're beginning to really look deeply at what is this restoration goal that could be set for open mine lands in West Virginia, and how do you make that attractive to the landowners that have that now, whether it's a large company or whether it's a small private owner of those acres. I would just also just say, in addition to that, all of this work has additional benefit from just not just carbon sequestration, but and monetization for the landowners to see an additional revenue stream. But when you look where West Virginia sits in surface water drinking supply for the country, every tree that we plant, every watershed that we protect, keeps that blue and makes it bluer. And if we think about this in terms of movement and climate change and where West Virginia sits in terms of importance, we're right there on the major highway when we think about how species will have to move around, how they can move to the future, and have the adaptability that they want. So every tree that gets planted, every avoided deforestation acre keeps this pathway intact and makes sure that there's hope not only for us here, but from the southern to the northern Appalachians as we think about the deconstruction and reconstruction under climate change. There, I got my ecology part in, so I feel better now. So I just want us to think differently and, to talk about, I'll end on TNC's transformation. When I started work for TNC 17 years ago, I was just really talking about flying squirrels and salamanders and ecosystem habitat types. But what we've realized is that the outcomes that we have for biodiversity are the same outcomes people want to see. We just use different languages to talk about them. And so when we think about the fact that we want to see big stands of forest because that holds the region together for climate adaptability, we're really also talking about the fact that people want to see a future in which they can live here, work here, play here, and thrive here. And those two things don't have to be mutually exclusive, particularly if we can find ways to think differently about our carbon economy here in West Virginia and have an additive value that sees some revenue for carbon in a slightly different way. Thank you.
Thanks. So I actually have some questions of my own, but I'm going to suggest we just move through the panel and hold the questions to the end. And I think we have some cards for adding, let's see, Jamie here. Yeah, so hold your questions, put them on cards, and I'm going to try to curate them so we can move through as many questions at the end as we can. So we'll move right on to Sarah Forbes.
Thanks. And I don't have slides today, so we're going to leave the ecology picture up. I am going to be talking about steel in the ground instead of trees in the ground. So we'll have a green backdrop for it. So I'm Sarah Forbes. I'm with the U.S. Department of Energy, Office of Fossil Energy, specifically the Office of Clean Coal and Carbon Management. I'm going to keep my remarks brief, but I want to do three things. First, I'm going to talk about our major demonstrations of carbon capture and storage technology, what's been done, what's in the ground, what's happened. Second, I'm going to talk about our current research priorities for clean coal and carbon management, and I'm going to focus on new and emerging themes that we're currently doing And finally, I'm going to talk about the policies, the tax incentives, and other policies that are ultimately needed for carbon capture. So with respect to demonstration projects of carbon capture and storage, we have three. We have the Petranova plant and Air Products and Chemicals, both in Texas, and we have a facility at the Archer Daniels Midlands plant in Illinois. One of them is with a coal-fired power plant, and two are with industrial facilities. The Petranova project is the coal-fired power plant. It is a retrofit of a coal-fired power plant. It uses an amine solvent to capture the CO2. The CO2 is then taken for enhanced oil recovery. I had the opportunity to walk on the grounds and visit that plant a couple of weeks ago and can tell you firsthand it is operating. It began operating in January of this year, and just this past week, they captured their millionth short ton of carbon dioxide. So a little bit of a milestone there. The Petranova plant was affected during the recent Hurricane Harvey, but only briefly. Within a week, it was back and up and operating. The Air Products and Chemicals plant in Port Arthur is so that's the one project that we have. It is the biggest in the world. It's the biggest carbon capture project on an existing coal-fired plant in the world. The other two demonstration projects that we have are in the industrial sector. The industrial sector offers opportunities for lower costs of carbon capture and because of the relatively pure streams of CO2. So in Port Arthur, Texas, the Air Products project is it's taking the CO2, capturing it from hydrogen production from an existing steam methane reformer. That project actually has not gotten a lot of press, but it began operating in March of 2013. And right now they're at about 4 million tons of CO2 captured. Like the Petranova project, the CO2 in that case is taken and used for enhanced oil recovery. And during the question and answer, we can get into the technology and what that means in any level of detail you'd like. The Archer Daniels Midland project is in Decatur, Illinois, and it's a little bit different than the others with respect to the CO2. So most of you probably, from the fermentation process, CO2 is emitted. In this case, it's collected, compressed, and then it's sent for geological storage. One of the neat things from a research and, DOE is a research and development organization. So from a research and development perspective, one of the neat things about that project is it built up in scale from a research project. So there was a pilot project that began many years ago. Actually, they began characterizing the regional sources and sinks of CO2 in Illinois back in about 2002, and then progressively led to bigger and bigger field tests. And this industrial project just started injection in April of this year. And it is the first project to use the US EPA has a well class for geological storage called Class 6. It's under the Underground Injection Control Program. And that project in Illinois is the first and currently the only project to be using that geological sequestration well class. Before I move on to talk about research and development, I would be remiss if I didn't say anytime you hear a representative from the Petranova project talk about it, they always will emphasize that project was completed on time and on budget. Really remarkable for a project of that size. The other thing that I should mention about all three of these projects is, although they're Department of Energy major demonstration projects, they would not have been possible. The DOE funding for these projects is really a fraction of the overall cost for the project. So the DOE investment helps make it happen, but ultimately these projects would not be capturing CO2 and storing it either through EOR or through geological sequestration without significant investment and involvement from industry. When we look across our clean coal and carbon management R&D program, we have five current priorities. One is that's emerging of increasing importance is on making coal plants more efficient. We also have research on improving those state-of-the-art carbon capture technologies so that more CO2 can be captured at lower costs with better performance. We have work on turning CO2 into valuable products, taking CO2 and using it in new and novel ways, on utilizing CO2 in enhanced oil recovery and also storing it for geological storage. And then we have some cross-cutting research on issues that in many cases cross-cut the department's research on things like, how we use the subsurface for energy, the energy-water nexus, supercritical CO2 fluids, which can help improve cycles and performance. I want to spend just a few minutes. So, the Longview power plant is efficient. It's one of the best in the country. I had the opportunity to visit this summer. Unfortunately, if you look across the fleet in the United States, our plants are not efficient. And there are a number of ways that we can work to improve the efficiency. Simple things, increasing the boiler efficiency, retrofitting the turbines, looking at improvements to, the nuts and bolts of a power plant, the condensers, pumps, fans, heaters, and other equipment. We can also do a better job of what we call coal beneficiation, cleaning the coal or making it so that it will burn more efficiently. There are things like capturing the CO2 and selling it. There are also other saleable products that a power plant can make. Really finding ways to optimize and maximize those opportunities can help at the individual plant level. And then, we have a good bit of research right now, and some of that is happening under the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center that Brian Anderson mentioned earlier, on looking at how coal plants operate in an environment where they're having to cycle more. Many of these plants were not designed to do that, so what are the novel sensors and controls that can help a coal plant be more flexible, do the job that it needs to do to the grid while also incorporating the increased renewables. Brian also briefly mentioned rare earth elements, and I just want to highlight that. I actually heard on NPR as I was driving to DC the other day that West Virginia University has a new project in that area. The bottom line is, most of our rare earth elements in the United States, the elements that are used for a variety of things, including many of our electronics, are actually coming from China. They have the worldwide market. So to increase our national security, to increase our energy security, there's a real opportunity to think about coal, both coal itself, but also coal wastes as a source for rare earth elements. And the research program in this area is relatively new, but the feasibility is proving out that there may be real economic opportunities to recover these rare earths from coals and from coal wastes, and generate new business streams. And also in some cases, when we're dealing with coal waste, you can also clean up waste streams. Right now, most of the work has been done in the feasibility stage, but like that description I gave of the Archer Daniel Midlands project, where it started with feasibility and ultimately moved up, that kind of path is very early stage with rare earth elements, but that's the ultimate vision and hope. I'll mention we have a National Carbon Capture Center that is operated by Southern Company in Alabama. More than 40 carbon capture technologies have been tested, including technologies like the Petranova Project, that's a post-combustion amine scrubber, but also pre-combustion. So many of you may be familiar with gasification systems. Capture technologies for gasification systems have also been tested there. Really a worldwide facility that's used by carbon capture technology developers from all over the world. I'm going to talk very briefly about policy so that we can get on to the rest of the panel and hear your questions. There are a number of tools that Congress is considering right now to provide financial incentives for carbon capture. There's an existing tax credit under Section 45Q of the IRS tax code. It has a cap of 75 million tons. It's a per ton of CO2 cap. So it will be available up until 75 million tons, and it should be reached relatively in the near enough term that Congress is considering bills to extend and improve it. There are currently active bills in the House and the Senate. Of course, whatever happens with the tax may get pulled into bigger discussions, and so we don't know. But there's strong stakeholder support from not just industry, but also state governments and the environmental and some environmental groups for finding ways to make that tax credit work so that it could provide a financial incentive. But tax credits on a per ton of CO2 basis don't address all of the financing gaps from a project perspective. And so Congress has also looked at things like master limited partnerships, private activity bonds, and CO2 price stabilization. Those have all been proposed not in this current Congress, but last year as mechanisms for addressing different financing gaps for a CCS project. And there are investment tax credits that are available at the federal and state level for clean coal that would also apply to a future carbon capture project. At the state level, there are two things I'd like to mention in conclusion. State level policies, there was a lot of activity on carbon capture and storage in around 2008, 2009. It seems like there's a little bit of new things bubbling up again. Worth mentioning is the California Air Resources Board, in addition to the work that they've done on forests, when they're working to finalize a quantification methodology for carbon capture and storage that would allow that to play both in the cap and trade and in the low carbon fuel standard. They've released some draft guidance. The devil is always in the details, and it's emerging, but could provide a potential opportunity. Now, when you hear quantification methodology, you always think about accounting. Oh, it's all about carbon accounting. And the one caveat I would give is that what California is doing is actually quite a bit more detailed than that. They're looking at proving the permanence, and in many ways, the permanence of the CO2 in the subsurface, as well as the methodology for accounting. So it's not just a bean counter, it's a holistic perspective of what it would take for geological storage of CO2 in enhanced oil recovery and in the subsurface generally to count under California's framework. The second state that's doing something or has done something worth noting is Wyoming. Wyoming, through its, I think it's called the Wyoming Pipeline Authority, has pre-approved corridors for CO2 pipelines in the state. They worked with the state and federal agencies and have tried to set up a business-friendly opportunity for CO2 pipelines in the state. CO2 pipelines are not a focus of our research program, but if we look at the history of how emerging energy technologies have entered the market in the United States, a pipeline infrastructure is one of those enablers that makes it happen. And in fact, globally speaking, the U.S. has more experience in enhanced oil recovery with CO2 than any other country. And most other countries are very uncertain about the pipelines and how it works and how to make it happen. And so the fact that we have a pipeline infrastructure in Texas is part of what's enabled that, the amount of CO2 that we've stored through enhanced oil recovery in the United States to date, and actions like Wyoming has taken is something states are doing to look forward. And with that, I'll look forward to your questions during the discussion.
Thank you. All right. Last but not least, we have, oops, I'm about to read the name we've already had, Patrick McGinley. And then I think those cards are going around. If you want to put some questions on those and pass those over to the side to Jamie, then I'll start looking through those. And I should probably make myself more useful and offer to collect cards, but. Yeah, great.
And do I use, is there a? Good morning. It's good to hear from the first two speakers the plans and the concepts that are being considered to stimulate an emerging energy economy for West Virginia. And Sarah Forbes talked about coal, the various opportunities to burn coal more cleanly, to advance coal use, and I think that's important. But what I want to talk about is putting coal in perspective in the emerging energy economy, because there are those politicians and others who suggest that coal production and coal employment will return to historic high levels, or at least that the coal market will not decline further. However, experts' analysis indicate that that's not the case. And so I think it's important in considering other forms of energy than coal, which has really been the major or a major mover of the economy in West Virginia for a century, that we take a look at the historic coal production and employment, and then at the analysis and projections for future coal employment in the present circumstance. So I have a couple of slides here I wanted you to take a look at. Let's see if I can get this to work. There. What do these things have in common? There's an early form of energy, whale oil. Until the first oil well was drilled in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859, whale oil was the predominant new energy in the United States and abroad. And there was a whale oil economy in the United States where there were thousands of workers that were involved in that economy. And of course, with the production of oil, whale oil was really dropped off the face of the earth, as did those jobs. What's this fellow's job? Pardon? Steeplejack. You know, how many steeplejacks do we have? Well, my grandfather was a steeplejack. He was an Irish. His father immigrated from Ireland, and the Irish did the hard work, and he was a steeplejack. But there aren't very many steeples, and he moved on to another occupation. He was a blacksmith, and of course, he was doing this around 1900, and then Henry Ford produced the automobile, and he had to move on to other work in that industry, which you found all over the country, because the way people traveled, for the most part, was by horse and carriage, and iron carriage, I guess, in the latter part of the 19th century. So he became, as many Irish did, he became a fireman. And then we have this. Does anybody recall film? Yeah, Rochester, New York, Kodak. The film industry collapsed. Doesn't exist anymore. Anybody remember this? You manufacture telephones with cords. It's gone. Job's gone. And finally, I think this fits, mountaintop removal, coal mining in southern West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and western Virginia. And it's going the way of the whale oil industry. That doesn't mean there will be no more mountaintop removal mining, but competition with shale gas, environmental externalities, declining market for metallurgical coal that's produced in southern West Virginia, and mistakes made by management that led to the bankruptcy of a number of leading coal companies has really brought most mountaintop removal mining to a halt, as well as public concerns about that. Let's take a look in this context at historic information about coal production and employment trends. Now, I don't think you're going to be able to see that, and I can't really see it, but I have it here, and just a couple of things from this chart. In 1949, 480 million tons of coal were mined. In 1975, 654 million. By 1984, 895 million, and coal production peaked at 1,171,000 tons in 2008. And what was, why did this increase in production occur? And a concomitant decline in coal mining jobs, and that was because of mechanization. Two modern innovations in mining methodology, the underground mining that produced enormous amount of coal with very few workers, came to West Virginia in around early 1970s in southwestern Pennsylvania, and large-scale surface mining, mountaintop removal mining, which came to West Virginia in the latter part of the 1980s. And so production increased enormously, employment dropped precipitously, and it was also added by the fuel switching after the Arab oil embargo of 1973. Electric utilities switched from what was then cheap oil, if I recall, gasoline at the pump. You know, I'm that old I can remember the price of gasoline in about 1973 was about 22 cents a gallon. And but then there was no oil available, and utilities looked to coal for a reliable source of energy without concerns about international affairs and events like the oil embargo. Here's a chart. It's just this is a national coal production from that same period of time. You can see the laser here, but bituminous coal production, which we have here in West Virginia, southwest Pennsylvania, the central Appalachians, overtaken by subbituminous. And that's another development in the coal market, subbituminous coal, mostly mined in Wyoming and Montana and in the West. Enormous production. That coal has low BTU, but the production is enormous, and that's competition with West Virginia and Central Appalachian coal. Again, this is the lower right-hand graph is production east of the Mississippi, west of the Mississippi. The red line, you can't see it, most of you, that's west of the Mississippi coal. So the majority of coal is coming from west of the Mississippi. More recently, coal production, this is as of the end of 2015, you can see coal production dropping nationally, and here in the right-hand corner, North and Central Appalachian coal, the price of it dropping, and you can see the subbituminous coal, the Powder River Basin coal, a little more than $10 a ton. That's what Appalachian coal is competing with. And here's some information on West Virginia coal mining employment and productivity. And this goes to the statement I made a little earlier, the more innovation in methodology, longwall mining, mountaintop removal mining, the less jobs. There's an inverse relationship to production and coal field employment. And here we have this. This is an older, few years old. It shows about 20,000 coal miners. It's significantly less than that in West Virginia today. And for West Virginia, productivity is declining significantly in the south, while increasing marginally in the north. And why is that? Well, the steam coal that is mineable at a saleable cost is being rapidly depleted, and in southern West Virginia, the other really high quality metallurgical coal used in steel mining, there's just not a market for it. There are projections that that metallurgical coal could be exported to Europe and other places for steel making. That did not occur. In fact, the use of coal for steel making in those markets has declined. And here's a very recent projection. Tuesday at the Energy Bar Association, the Battle Group presented a study of the possible trends with the Trump administration's pro-coal agenda and the Trump administration pro-fossil fuel agenda. And what it says basically is that if the Trump administration is successful in instituting a pro-fossil fuel agenda and regulatory changes, coal will lose. Coal production will drop. And it doesn't show in any event a major increase in the coal market. And of course, these are projections. They're subject to change. There are variabilities, but that's an example of something that experts who have no axe to grind, who are looking at the market objectively, say that it doesn't look good for expanding coal or for a return to the historic employment and production. Now, basically, some of the figures, coal production in 2016 was down 37% from peak production of 1,171 million tons in 2006. Nationally, employment of coal miners in the U.S., 50,000. In 1923, it was 883,000. Historically, coal mining was very labor-intensive. When machinery was introduced, the continuous mining equipment in the late 1930s, 1940, production increased and employment dropped, but not precipitously. It really is in the last 30, 40 years, the emergence of longwall and large-scale surface mining. U.S. exports of coal have declined since 2012. In 2015, the U.S. exported 7% of mined coal. Coal mined from Wyoming, West Virginia, Kentucky, Illinois, and Pennsylvania produced 639 million tons in 2015. That's 71% of total coal production, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. U.S. coal production dropped to a 30-year low in 2016. And that, as I said earlier, that's thanks in large part to shale gas prices that are much more competitive than coal, and especially coal mined in the central Appalachia. And we see utilities, and I'm sure that will be discussed more here today, utilities switching from coal to natural gas. In 1986 is the last time that U.S. coal production was as low as it is today. And so, to sum up, coal will continue to be mined, not at historic levels. There's some promise because of the research that's being done that coal production, coal use, and employment will continue at some level. It's not clear that it will increase at all. Of course, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm basing these projections on the opinions of people who are experts in the energy field. But because coal won't return to its former levels, that gives impetus for what we're talking about here at the conference today, the need for adaptation, resilience, diversity, creative thinking in looking at the economy and using our natural resources, whether it's forestry or ethane, what we have here available to us to generate a diverse and sustainable economy. With regard to coal mining, the restoration, as Tom Menney said, the restoration of strip mined lands. There are really literally thousands of acres of mountaintop removal land was not reforested. That could be done. And there's literally thousands of acres of mountaintop removal mined land that was not reclaimed. Coal companies in bankruptcy. There is over $1 billion in the Federal Abandoned Mine Reclamation Fund that could be used to put West Virginians at work to restore those unreclaimed mine lands. And then there are also potential with those lands to use them for solar and especially wind energy. So that's a report on coal. And I think there's a lot of good news here, and you'll hear a lot of good news at the conference. It's not all bad for coal. Coal miners will continue to be employed. There's still a market for coal, and there will be in the coming decades. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, we covered a lot of ground in this panel. I think it does all sort of harken back to this theme of doing things differently going forward, accepting that things are going to be different, and being innovative and creative with how we do that. I'm gonna, maybe we'll pass the cards into the middle of the room. I keep making Jamie work very hard here. And I'm gonna take the moderator's prerogative to ask a few questions while we're collecting those, because that's the advantage of being here at the microphone. So just sort of going in the order which we covered topics, I wanted to ask Thomas Menney if he could comment on, well, first of all, I'm happy to be aware of that new PNAS report that you wrote.
Okay.
That's brand new. It looks like it's hot off the
2
presses.
weeks
Yeah,
ago.
so I have not had a chance to look at that, so this might be a question that's answered in that work. But when you think about natural carbon solutions, I think is the term you used, there's an appeal to that because it is making use of Mother Nature, but there's also a complexity to that in terms of accounting. And so I wonder if you could comment on the potential to, for mistakes really in accounting and not being able to accurately account for the amount of carbon benefit you get from using biomass. There's a lot of uncertainty in those estimates.
Are you talking about, so to clarify, so you're talking about a project accountability or total offset accountability?
Well, both. I mean, so like if you're going to be giving people, if the idea is eventually to give people
Sure.
credits for those things, you know, I mean, it's the complexity of the system is subject to manipulation, and there's just, I mean, just frankly scientific uncertainty, right? The science is always improving in terms of understanding that. So, I mean, how do you see us being able to manage that alongside other types of energy resources that
Sure.
that are maybe less complex?
Well, I mean, when I look at it from a project perspective, I have higher confidence because we use third-party certification. The science that's emerging around this is really good science at the project level. At the start of any one of these particular projects, there's a baseline that's taken that's pretty accurate and intense. So I think I can say that there's a high level of accountability and a high level of cross-referencing at the project level. I don't know if I'm qualified at all to talk about at the global level, you know, when we look at how this factors into the multiple, you know, pathways for emissions and what this means. I think it, you know, at the graphic on the chart kind of got it, what I'm trying to answer here, which is I think we see our slice. We see the slice that forest, the expansion of forest carbon sequestration can have in offsetting overall goals. But I'm not sure if I can answer well the question relative to can we add that up? Is there a great, robust accounting system for that? I think that falls to the folks that are working on our forest carbon programs somewhere else. In this state, Campbell Moore, it worked for the Central Appalachians program. Cam was hired in because he has a background. He worked for the Rainforest Alliance in their forest certification program. So I would recommend that if anybody knows that, can see that I'm waffling a little bit, that we say we can reach out to Campbell, and Campbell probably would have a better answer to that.
Okay, great. There are a number of sort of technical questions about your work, so might have to direct people to the PNAS report for
Yeah.
that. So one of them is whether or not these mountaintop removal sites are really suitable for this type of forest growth.
Sure. And that's questions, that's, you know, it's like every other project that you put on the ground when you're planting trees or doing a piece of real estate. Every project's different. So, you know, several of these areas that are former mountaintop removal sites or open grasslands that have come from other impacts, they're completely suitable for reforestation. Others take quite a bit of preparation. You know, the work that we're doing on the Upper Shavers Fork with the Casry group required a lot of prior prep to make sure that those trees could grow. You know, and the picture's good. I think there's a huge opportunity, but I think the other emerging trend that we're seeing when we think about putting these projects on the ground, particularly relative to formerly mined coal lands, is liability issues that are left over. So that's something else that'll have to be dealt with as we think about this in the future. This doesn't just go for forest carbon, it goes for mine land restoration with solar, it goes with any type of emerging energy use that would be put onto these mine lands. The liability issues relative to those lands is a major impact to project viability.
That's actually leads to another question, which is sort of how do you understand the trade-off for the use of these lands with other uses? So reforestation versus maybe putting solar panels there versus,
Sure.
you know,
So
uses of the land.
I guess the way I would answer that question is when I look at a 10,000 acre open site in West Virginia, I'm sort of all in on that site. There's plenty of room for doing a large scale reforestation effort, plus if you have 10,000 acres, there's not going to be a 10,000 acre solar array that's going to go into West Virginia for multiple reasons. Some of it's topography, some of it other reasons. But so I think that when we look at these projects, we should be looking at them from the monetization point of how do you get it all? How can we do a project that gets 9,000 acres out of a 10,000 acre site reforested with maybe some renewable development on the side, plus any other job growth with small scale agriculture or others? I think it's more complex than just we're going to reforest this site. There's multiple opportunities at each site, and there's room for those multiple opportunities.
Can I say something about that? Because I've done some work relating to mountaintop removal. One of the impediments to reforestation is the way the lands were reclaimed when the mines were backfilled, the soil was compacted. It's not very good soil in any event. And so the cost of going in and sort of redoing that to modify and loosen up the soil so that it can take root, that's an impediment.
Yep.
Also, I'm wondering you mentioned liabilities. I mean, they certainly, large areas of southern West Virginia, a 10,000-acre site would seem to be a great prospect for not only for solar or wind, but for industrial development. Drawback being the lack of utilities and public services. But I don't understand what the liabilities would be.
Sure. So if there are impacts from mining where there's, acid mine drainage or any of the leftover issues that would be a brownfields issue on those sites, those go with the land. So whoever maintains or owns that land takes on whatever liabilities that come with it. So if there is an outstanding bond that's not complete or restoration that's not complete, TNC buying 10,000 acres, part of that deal is going to be somebody's going to have to take on the liability that comes with that. So that is a first and foremost when we think about changing economies in West Virginia and thinking about how we will address some of these mine lands in the South, which offer great opportunity. It is one of those first impediments that we have to think about. That's a sort of a built-in externality on each project.
Well, maybe we should talk about that because I don't see that as a major impediment for then there are legal issues that related to that. But
yeah, if we can, that would be great actually, because if West Virginia comes up with a way to resolve how to deal with that liability, it takes one of the major factors that's keeping people from locating here immediately, because they have to figure this out too. If you're a solar company, you have to figure out what liability are you taking on.
well, one approach would be to use the power of eminent domain. The land has little value now, and that would, whatever liability, if you have bankrupt companies, they're not going to be able to pay in any event. So, and then using abandoned mine reclamation funds to backfill and reclaim and cut out any acid mine drainage, which they don't have much of in southern West Virginia. So that's not going to be that big of a problem. But in terms of conveying the land,
sure,
you could cut that out of the conveyance and therefore eliminate the liability.
Great. Well, you guys got to the last question that I was going to ask about on this topic, which was institutional barriers for doing this and particular things in West Virginia. So nice job. You covered the ground. So I'm going to pivot now, and because I have a lot of questions related to CCS. And sort of paraphrasing a handful of these loosely as, should we really be doing CCS instead of solar? In so many words. And so I'm going to take a moment to just comment that the IPCC scenarios for mitigating climate change rely heavily on us finding a way to do CCS at a large scale. The international agencies that are thinking about this problem at a global scale recognize the importance of CCS. So I'm just going to say right now that we do really need to have this tool in our toolkit. That's my commentary there. The other thing is that the question that I was going to ask Sarah was about the potential for CCS in conjunction with natural gas, in conjunction with biomass, in conjunction with the example that you gave, which was industrial applications. And so I think that's really if we really want to get to where we need to be in terms of climate change and carbon mitigation, that's where we're going to need to go. And CCS is a relevant technology, not just for coal, but for these other things. So I wonder if you can comment on that, the applications into other sectors, and then also, the international potential as well, where coal is being built every day.
So building on your point about the IPCC report and our reliance on CCS as a climate mitigation technology, when you dig into the scenarios, not only is CCS required, but significant amounts of negative emissions from bioenergy with CCS is required in most of the scenarios. They ran some scenarios in the last series of reports where they had models that did and didn't have CCS, and most of the models that excluded CCS failed to solve. So it's, that was an excellent point Amy made. And I think builds on because CCS and the research for CCS has been been part of the coal research program. And because it can apply to coal plants, it's often been wedded together. That said, the approach that you use for carbon capture for a coal plant, you can also apply that same solvent technology to a natural gas plant. And when you look in the industrial sector, many of those sources of CO2, the costs are actually more favorable relative to coal, and there are options for capturing and storing carbon. It's ultimately a policy decision, and I think electric generating units have long been a target for CCS because they are a solution for fossil-fueled electric generating units and because they're a large source of emissions.
Right, great. And I think, maybe this is a question for everybody, and I'll again take the prerogative of commentating. The question is basically around the idea of we've talked about a suite of technologies: energy efficiency, CCS, reforestation. There's a lot of ways to tackle the climate change mitigation problem, and this question relates to how do we balance across those investments, which is a wiser investment. And I would say I think we're in such a pickle we can't really afford to choose. We need to do all of these things. But I don't know if you guys have a comment on how you think about how we prioritize these investments in climate change mitigation.
So I'll just jump in very quickly, but I think others have much more to say about this, and say this is something that actually comes up in the international discussions of climate change funding and how you solve the problem. And one of the challenges internationally for carbon capture and storage in some of the climate funds has been the projects are big and they cost a lot. They cost a lot relative to some of the other climate solutions, and so that's made it a difficult and ill fit. One of the things that there were two international points on CCS over the past couple of weeks. Norway had a big industrial project that they were looking to move forward, and it looks like that's not so promising. On the other hand, the Dutch government is now expressing more interest in moving forward, and so it's hard to get done, and these trade-offs are difficult. But I'll let others answer it.
Well, it really comes down to how much carbon reduction, greenhouse gas emissions can you get for the dollar, and that's why carbon capture and sequestration being such a big ticket item, and in order to turn it into a reality, that's a real obstacle. And if you can bring the price down or find other products to extract from that waste stream, that could make it more viable.
I would just go back to that second or third slide I showed. I mean, no matter, within the sector of what carbon capture by trees could do was 14% of, the emissions right now, right? So you've got a pretty big gap, and even by 2030, if we keep expanding this out, it's only going to be 30%. So I think it's an all-the-above strategy. I would agree that it's driven by what's the amount of carbon you get per dollar you're investing. I would say, though, for a group like TNC, and for myself personally, I would say that we'll be behind investing also in those technologies and approaches that are going to drive the transition to lower carbon at all times. And so when I think about prioritization, I think about what do we get for our dollar, how much carbon gets captured for that dollar, and I think what are we investing in to drive us towards making sure that there are lower and lower emissions at all times.
Great. I'm going to pivot one more time. Maybe we'll take a few more questions. Is that good, or should we? Two more? Okay. So thinking about the history that you gave us on all the industries that have come and gone, and it's sort of the natural life cycle of innovation, right? Something's the hot new thing, people do it, and then they move on to the next thing. So you could think of the coal industry in general, and then particularly in this region, as being just another victim of the inevitable. So do you think there's something different about this? I mean, it seems like there's just much more emotion and culture built into this. Is it unique to this industry? Is it a sign of the times? What makes it so emotional?
Well, it's sustained coalfield communities for a century, and the lack of economic diversity in the coal fields makes the possibility of the demise of the coal industry and the loss of jobs extremely anxiety producing. I think if you could bring sustainable jobs to the coal fields where people could make comparable salaries, then coal would be like the whaling industry. But moreover, coal is not going the way of the whaling industry now. As a bridge fuel, it's going to continue. There's going to continue to be production. And in meetings like this and organizations like those that are involved here, coming up with ideas of how to reduce greenhouse gases, ultimately there's going to be a phase out of fossil fuel combustion to generate electricity, but it's very different than when oil was first produced. That was the end of whaling. When the car appeared, horse-drawn carriages stopped. So I think that's a big difference.
Great. And then sort of last question to wrap up. I guess this is really for everybody. We talked about this idea of trading off against different solutions for mitigating climate change. And sort of the flip side of that is thinking about the best policies that would get us to the point of being able to make those choices in the market. The rational choices that basically say, this is the cheapest way to do it, do that first, then build this, then build this. So I wonder if you guys could comment on what you think would be the right way to tackle this at a policy level, either at a state level or federal level. Even if it's not necessarily politically tractable in the near term, what are the right things what are the policy levers we should be trying to pull to help us make this transition?
Well, I guess, from the TNC perspective, we look at the voluntary markets, and they're actually quite robust. They do generate some dollars and some projects, but they aren't at the level nor at the scale and scope that would really ameliorate the issue. So the Nature Conservancy has been engaged on multiple levels with cap and trade legislation across the country. So I would just leave it at that. That's kind of where we've been engaged to try to find ways that you can find a regulatory approach that may have benefit and is feasible. Right now in the policy arena, is that feasible? Probably not, but that's where we have been.
A couple of years ago, I had this question, and I dug up a Harvard paper that looked at comparative policies, and I was thinking about it through a CCS lens, of course, and it said that, government-funded R&D was the way, and yet what we see in practice is that any one thing is never enough. That, even if you're looking at one technology, you need to address, my slide on policy, I talked about the different, policies that address the different aspects of financing a project. And I think that's, you could expand that and look wholeheartedly that there probably is no single solution, and it's really an all hands on deck.
Just briefly, I'm not optimistic because we're talking in this context about moving away from fossil fuels. There is so much money, extraordinary amount of money, that seeks to preserve existing value of fossil fuels and brings us into the public discourse, the climate change denial, the alleged war on coal that are not fact-based, but the driver behind those are an enormous amount of money going into public relations and campaign contributions. And that's a real impediment. If in the public arena people can start talking about reality and facts and science, and the public and people can really realize the threats that are posed and see beyond the fictional impediments and what's the president say, fake news. I think that's when we're going to be able to develop policies that can advance the public interest.
I didn't mean to end on such a downer note there, because I think we had a lot of conversation today about exciting new ways to think about tackling this problem. You know, the idea of having a federal cap and trade or carbon tax or something like that that would push innovation forward, you know, may seem like a far-off dream, but it sounds like there's a lot of good stuff going on in the meantime.
Well, there is,
Keep
but
chugging
you know,
away.
the cap and trade bill, the Waxman-Markey bill, was there when the Democrats had a majority in Congress, and it didn't pass.
That's right. I got a little optimistic when there was the several former government officials under both parties that were pushing for the carbon tax. They wrote the piece a couple months ago. I thought maybe we can really go with this, but it kind of came and went. So for another time. All right, well, thank you very much to all three of you, and thank you, everybody, for your questions.
We'll take a 10-minute break right now. We'll be back for our second panel in 10 minutes.
No, I love that. Is it good? Oh, thank you. I mean, how, is it rosy or is it just sort of optimistic? I've been doing this for over 40 years with the coal industry.
The context section of a great job really like diving into the just some statistics and figures that I have not seen in other state Now the scenarios, they're all very optimistic. They're all what happens if we get evidence for the scenarios, what happens if our example is successful. So it's very much like the projections.
Right.
Is going to be and it's going to be optimistic, and you're going to be optimistic. But
Science, you know, technology can change the game. But, you know, you had this report from the battle group that I put out on there. I mean, they don't have an exit line, and they're looking at scenarios, although, you know, it depends on developments. But they're see that. But I really like to see that. It would be great if, you know,
I agree. But also we haven't,
oh, really? I've been working Ukraine.
well, I hope it'll be useful for you.
I'm not with the Russians, though.
That's what they all say.
Yeah, not a surrogate for the Russians. It was a pleasure.
Hi.
Oh, thanks.
For a lawyer, you're just, you know, I mean, I'm an engineer.
I'm just a teacher. That's what I say with my friends.
I have used that, you know, when was the last time you bought film?
Yeah, right.
I was thinking about that. I almost put a horse up there. Oh,
And how many?
This is a lot of cities stuff. Because I saw just a 6 to Facebook. It's not Facebook, it has to be real and accurate.
And that's the Russian.
Well, that could happen. Of course not. For Russians, I would believe it.
That's right. Who would have that? I can't even read that stuff.
They can't be Russians. They said they're from
So I'm talking about environmental impact from coal mines, which mostly is on stream.
Want to get started again with our next panel? If everybody can come in and grab a seat. Let's get our panelists up here at the table. Yeah, maybe get the door. Okay, you troublemakers over there. Okay, we're going to get started with the next panel. If you could take a seat, and we're going to move on. The second panel, I'm pleased to introduce the moderator of the second panel, my colleague at the Center for Energy and Sustainable Development, Josh Vershey. He's our Associate Dean for Research and Development. And as with the previous panel, we'll be circulating 3x5 cards. And if you have any questions of any of the panelists, then we'll gather those cards and present them to Josh, and then he'll be able to serve the moderator and try to keep the combine those questions when we get to the question and answer period of the panel. So I'll turn it over to Professor Vershey.
Well, thank you, Jamie, and thank you, everyone, for being here. We're glad to have you at WVU College of Law. I am Josh Vershey. I'm a professor here at the college. I teach and conduct research as part of the Center for Energy and Sustainable Development. I'm also part of the WVU Center for Innovation in Gas Research and Utilization, which is an interdisciplinary group based in the Statler College of Engineering, which conducts research directed at innovative pathways for shale gas utilization with the goal of maximizing benefit to the region. I'm happy to be part of this panel today. It's an important one called Minimizing the Environmental Impact of Energy Production and Distribution. Natural resources are a critical part of West Virginia's economy, and minimizing the environmental impacts related to resource extraction is not only important for our health and safety, it's critical for our economy. We have learned in a variety of settings, most notably the Deepwater Horizon well disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, that environmental disasters are also economic disasters. I'm thrilled to introduce you to our esteemed panel today, who will share with us ways to minimize environmental impacts while engaging in sustainable practices that can support development in the state and our region. Our first speaker is Todd Miller, who works with landowners, watershed associations, agency partners, mitigation banks, and private clients to restore natural functions in watershed streams and wetlands, and to decrease risks to people from stream bank erosions, flooding, and other similar issues. He and his team assess and prioritize restoration sites, develop new restoration plans, and manage on-the-ground projects. Todd worked in the Peace Corps and has a background in community planning, both of which prepared him for his work with communities and agencies seeking to restore our streams and watersheds. Next, Angie Rosser will speak to us. She joined the West Virginia Rivers Coalition as executive director in 2012 to continue her work on social justice issues in the nonprofit sector in West Virginia. She engages in clean water advocacy to protect access to clean water and to ensure conservation of the region's water resources. Angie's a co-chair of the National Wildlife Federation's Water Caucus and is the current co-chair of the Choose Clean Water Coalition, which works to protect and restore the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Earlier this year, she was recognized by River Network as their National River Hero and earned that award. She is also happens to hold a master's degree in organizational communication from WVU. And finally, Susan Packard-LeGros is the president and executive director of the Center for Responsible Shale Development and has extensive experience in energy, environmental, and natural resources law across multiple industries and applications. Prior to joining the center, she was a high-level attorney in private practice, serving clients on a variety of issues in energy and environmental matters, including representation at state and federal agencies, as well as project development and finance. She began her career as an attorney for the U.S. EPA and went on to work as in-house counsel at several large international corporations before entering private practice. Each speaker is going to have about 20 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions at the end of their presentations. And with that, welcome Todd Miller.
Thanks, Josh. From the beginning. Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. It sure is great to be here. It's just been a great conference so far. I've really enjoyed meeting all the people I've met, enlightening conversations. I don't usually get to hang out in an energy crowd, so I'm learning a lot. So I work for Canaan Valley Institute. We're a small nonprofit up in Tucker County, West Virginia, and we serve the state of West Virginia as well as Western Maryland, Western Virginia, and have worked in the past in Pennsylvania too. We work in multiple areas. I manage our stream restoration team. And so I'm going to be talking today about impacts we've seen from coal mine sites, not because coal mines are all we do, but because we've had to work on some and we've learned some things on the way. So I'm going to talk about 3 sites. One is a site Thomas referred to in his presentation. It's the Mauer Tract. It's up on Sheep Mountain in the Monongahela National Forest, elevations from 3,000 to 4,000 feet roughly. And this was mined in the 80s before the Forest Service acquired it. So it's post-Smacra mining. It was left very stable. It actually won awards for the quality of reclamation that happened there. And indeed, it is very stable. The problem is that it's in a state of arrested ecological succession. We've got these fields of grass on compacted soils. We've got exotic trees there that are pretty stunted, not growing very well. Ecologically speaking, it's really not what it should be. And what it should be is a red spruce forest. That looks kind of like this. This is a young red spruce forest. But it's not like that right now. Red spruce has many, many benefits, especially carbon sequestration. It's one of the forest types that actually sequesters more carbon underground than above ground. The acid soil has a role in that. So on the Mauer Tract, there's been many efforts since about 2010 to restore the forest ecosystem there. It started with just trying to plant trees, and that completely failed. The soil was just too compacted. Those trees didn't last a year. And so the Forest Service learned they had to deep rip the soils, decompact them. So they have big dozers with big shanks on the back of them that they pull that literally just rips up the soil. They do it in kind of a grid pattern and just totally makes a big, giant mess. But it prepares the place for reforestation and tree planting with little native red spruce and other high elevation species to get this ecosystem going again. They've also torn out a lot of the exotic pines that were stunted. They are not growing very well, not reproducing, and there's some benefits to having some organic matter on the ground released slowly. So one of the other issues we were brought in to deal with was road runoff. And so this is a picture starting at the bottom left there. We found this stream that needed restoration. We thought it was a stream, and we walked up it and turned a few corners, and we realized it was a road. This was an old road that had just completely blown out from runoff accumulating higher in the watershed. And so here's a LiDAR image of the road network that was up in this place. And you can see how one road sort of may intercept groundwater and capture surface water and direct it into another road, and it sort of funnels down to places in the bottom where you get steep gullies going right down the slope. So we were brought in to do road decommissioning, which is taking big excavators and decompacting and outsloping the surface, planting native seed and red spruce as we go. And so what this does is it takes these eroding gullies and it pretty much does away with the surface water. It puts that water back underground where it can absorb into groundwater and get released much more slowly as cool spring water, which is much better for the watershed, for stability, for brook trout, for many things. Made a lot of progress over the years. Phase 1, Phase 2, they're starting Phase 3. I wanted to recognize Appalachian Stewardship Foundation as being one of the key funders up there. There have been many partners involved over the years, and so it's a pretty big effort. I want to shift gears to a pre-SMACRA site in Logan County, West Virginia. We worked with a mitigation bank to find places down there we could fix for mitigation under the Clean Water Act, places we could restore streams. And it was kind of a difficult process to find something we could actually fix. So one of the sweet spots we found was sort of older coal mining, where the scale of operations was still small enough that we could sort of put things back together again, at least in little bits. So if you can see the colors on that topo map, there's the watershed we worked in is outlined in yellow there, and there's sort of a gray ring around the inside of it that's an old mine bench. And that bench, so it's an old high wall mine, and what you had was streams coming off the high wall into gullies, onto the bench, and then diverted any which way but where the streams used to take their water, which is down into the valley bottoms below. And so lots of stream restoration potential there. We also had roads intercepting drainages, gas well pads to deal with, and some exotic vegetation that had been brought in. So here's a picture. The upper left picture is of the top of the high wall, where the stream kind of pours off its natural bed down into a steep gully down onto the bench, and you can see the water pooled up there on the bench. And from where it's pooled, then it runs down the bench, not to the middle of the valley where there's a stream bed for it that's now left dry, but it finds a low spot, which is the middle picture, and then it gullies down from there into the valley bottom in a new channel. So meanwhile, it's taking all that loose fill material and depositing it in the stream valley below, which is not good for critters or stream functions or other things. The top is a digital elevation model of what this bench looks like in one of the valleys we worked on. It shows a valley coming in from the top and several valleys coming in from the side, and how they hit that bench. And you can sort of imagine how those benches are sort of tilted back into the slope. So the water accumulates along the back toe of that slope and runs, like I say, every way but down into the valley below where it should go. The bottom image is a sort of a cut fill model of how to rebuild that valley to get a stream that goes down down into the valley below again, where it should go, reconnecting the plumbing of the watershed. So this is a picture of the streams once built. We use lots of wood in the channel. There's many benefits of that, but they're built to be stable over time, but to reconnect the flow from above that mine bench to down below to back into the main stem stream on the valley bottom. So down below the bench, there were also some pretty big gullies that were left over. When things aren't left in a stable state, they tend to get worse over time, and that's certainly what happened here. This gully would have kept eroding for I don't know how many more years until it would probably be self-consuming for a long, long time, the way those steep side slopes were. You can see trees trying to grow up but keep falling down into it, et cetera, et cetera. So we designed this, which is pulling some of that loose fill out, using it elsewhere, stabilizing slopes, and building a stable pool with natural, a stable stream with natural steps and pools running through there, dissipating energy, transporting organic materials. They're all full of fish now. It's acting like a stream again. Here was a site with a gas well pad on the upper left there. That white thing is sort of an old gas well. This actually, this gas, we tried to decommission these little gas wells, but it feeds a nearby shopping area directly. So it was in use, in demand, and we couldn't do that. So we had to work around them as best we could, and so that meant sort of reshaping little valleys and stream channels around these gas wells and roads, and pulling out this old failing culvert and rebuilding a stabilized stream crossing there that the gas folks could get over, but so could the fish. I mentioned before we use wood in a lot of our restoration work. If you go up a natural stream channel in a forest, that's what's in there. There's rocks and boulders and things forming the pattern of the channel, but there's also a lot of wood. It captures sediment, it captures leaf pack, it gets the macroinvertebrates growing. It's pretty important. The map here, those red spaghetti lines all over, is the road network in this place. That's a 700-acre watershed, and there was about 25 linear miles of roads in there, all over the place. Some of them were left over from coal mining. Some of them were from more recent timber jobs. But you can see how they would affect drainage patterns. And so this image on the left, if you can see, there's faint yellow lines going up into some of those valleys. Those are streams that are not there, but we think should be there based on drainage area and slope, et cetera. And you can see how the road network around them is probably funneling a lot of water away from those little stream valleys, just redirecting flow. This was one of the first projects in West Virginia, and maybe across a bigger region, where we actually got mitigation banking credits to decommission roads to restore streams, which is pretty cool. Something we learned from the Forest Service that is now part of mitigation banking practice. Here's a picture of the road decommissioning there, outsloping, decompacting. One of the other problems we've had on the site that we didn't know we would have to this extent is exotic vegetation. So all those streams have native trees and shrubs and herbaceous plants planted along them. We have to monitor those for 10 years as part of this mitigation bank for credit releases. And within 1 year, some of these plots got completely overtaken in exotic vegetation. This is Lespedeza, Chinese Lespedeza, and it has taken off like mad. I had a list of exotic plants at this site, and this wasn't even on my list. There's only 3 or 4 of those around if you drive around the watershed, but it was in the seed bank, and when we stirred all that up to restore these sites, we just released those seeds, and they're growing like crazy. So I've been crawling around in there trying to count trees under that stuff. It's about knee high, and I don't know what we're going to do. But this was a legacy plant that was in there to stabilize soils from the mining days, and it was kind of on the decline, but it's not anymore. The third site that I wanted to highlight is a mountaintop mine site. So more modern mining. This is in Logan County. You can see we were actually working on a project in the valley below, in that wooded area down below the mined mountaintops. But we started to follow the gullies that we saw that we were trying to fix upstream. And so we had to get on the mountaintop mine to see what was going on. And so what we saw was there's a series of constructed ditches like this here that lead to an NPDES outlet where the mine has to monitor their water quality of their outfall from their whole stormwater management system up there. And the way the road system works around those mountaintops is there's ditches along all of them, and they take water from one area and move it to another area and drop water down these stabilized ditches into little stream valleys below, but those are stream valleys that are not always sized and not built by Mother Nature to contain the flows that come from this big bare area uphill. So here's some pictures up above is the upper right corner there. Upper left from your angle is looking at one of the roadside ditches, and then the sort of stabilized rock ditch that takes it downstream. And then the bottom pictures are where that rock channel ends at the mine permit boundary. And it's just totally blown out. It was a little channel. It wasn't, nature didn't make it for that amount of flow. Here's another site. There's a valley fill followed by a pond to capture some of the storm water and let things settle out. And then that led into a little stream channel below that was also completely blown out. It's off the mine permit boundary. It's become a huge self-consuming gully, a source of sediment, etc. So that was also restored. Restoring streams there means a little bit of valley restoration. Part of this work is working with these people, these contractors. And what was really interesting in these sites were the people we got to work with. So the guy driving the big bulldozer with the shank on it, ripping up the soil on the Mauer tract in the Forest Service on the upper left there, his name is Alan, I think. And Alan used to work hauling out coal from that same site. So that's kind of a neat thing. So now he's helping to restore it. The other folks there in those pictures, we hired an out-of-state company to do this big restoration project because it was bigger than most of the in-state companies could handle, and they were working on our other projects. They had to find local help. They hired local equipment operators. They were laid off coal miners, but they were good equipment operators. They had the skills. They worked hard, and this is what they do now. This is what they do. They're part of this crew. They go all over West Virginia and multiple states doing restoration work. Pretty neat story. So I was on the web yesterday, and I came across these charts showing the value of the ecological restoration industry and also the number of jobs created and how high that is because it's very labor intensive. So it's kind of a neat picture to think about, especially in southern West Virginia. These are areas that have been hemorrhaging jobs, hemorrhaging people, and things are pretty rough down there. So this isn't the topic of my talk, but I wanted to include it because I think from a human and societal value down there, maybe there's some hope that restoration can do important things there ecologically and economically too. Just to sum up, these are some of the lessons we've learned from stream restoration. So these aren't all the impacts of coal mines, but we've learned about the importance of restoring soils and forests and carbon sequestration on these sites, avoiding non-native plants, minimizing stream impacts on-site and off-site, decommissioning roads, really thinking about the resilience of these landscapes and how to restore that, and then finally, we're creating jobs. So that's all I have today, and I'll look forward to the discussion that comes. Thank you.
All right, good morning. I'm so glad to be with you today, but not as glad as I am when I'm on my river or in the woods. This is my backyard river, the Elk. The Elk is our longest river that starts and ends within our state's borders. It's stressed by coal mining and natural gas production. It's also infamous. It was the victim of a massive chemical leak that resulted in the largest scale chemical contamination drinking water crisis in our nation's history in January of 2014 in Charleston and the 9 counties surrounding area. Last summer, epic flooding. That floating dock isn't there anymore. But it's also that what you're seeing behind me is critical habitat for the diamond darter, one of the most rarest fish in the world. Only 20 of these have been identified, and they're all in the Elk River. So. But I'm glad that to hear what's coming together today is that we're not able to separate environmental impacts from social aspects and economic aspects. And part of I've always loved the river. But actually it was more of the social justice concerns that drew me in. I'll never forget, I was lobbying on another issue at the state capitol, and I heard a public hearing about the Horizontal Well Control Act. I think it was about 2007, 2008. And a gentleman from Wetzel County got up and he started talking about the impact of the shale gas boom in his community and on his farm. And he said, I used to go out with my kids on summer nights and we'd stargaze, and because of this well pad and the 24/7 light pollution, we can't see the stars anymore. And it just, it took my breath away. It's like, what's going on here? And I ended up going up to Wetzel County, saw what's going on about 10 years ago, and it was amazing how rapidly it seems things like were changing for these rural communities and their way of life. So anyway, to think, our challenge at West Virginia Rivers is to take the science and the work that many of you are doing in this room and explaining this to policymakers and to the general public in a way they understand and in a way they can relate it to their everyday lives and how it impacts them personally. What I'm here to highlight today, and I just want to kick off with some background on how we got one aspect of our work that got into looking at how we minimize environmental impacts, particularly water, from shale gas development. And we did this by partnering almost 5 years ago now with Trout Unlimited and the Appalachian Stewardship Foundation to create a volunteer-based citizen stream monitoring program. And what set our project apart is we started with the science and looked at data from organizations like the Nature Conservancy and a Conservation Success Index, and looked at where are the priority areas in the state in terms of water and watersheds that are most vulnerable to shale gas development and perhaps environmental impact. So we did this mapping exercise. It gave us an idea of where the shale deposits are, their likelihood for development, and high priority watersheds, and partnering with Trout Unlimited. Obviously, we were looking at some of the cold water fisheries and the native and wild trout habitat. So that's how we started. And then shortly after, we started hearing about these huge pipeline projects. And it seemed like, as drilling kind of came into a lull, the next phase was this infrastructure build out and the pipelines. And those red lines you see there were the early routes of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and the Mountain Valley Pipeline. And it's like, you're going to do what? You're going to go through these, high quality headwater streams and very rugged mountainous terrain. And that's when and unprecedented kind of in terms of length and size of these pipelines on this kind of landscape and these high quality watersheds. So we shifted our program a little bit and concentrated on training our volunteers to be able to collect baseline data on these pipeline routes and to prepare for construction and monitoring what's happening as those pipelines are constructed in terms of impacts to the water quality. We did a little closer honing in of these routes and looked at where trout populations were. And again, looked at what are the priority places we wanted to get that baseline data. So hopefully we can detect problems early and minimize those environmental impacts. So just some successes of this project so far. This is actually out of date. We've had a couple more trainings. We're at close to 30 trainings and over 400 volunteers trained, and almost 400 sites that have been monitored in these priority areas. Here's our crew who was out in the Mon National Forest last week. We had what we call the Mon Snapshot Day, where we sent teams out into those priority areas, collected around data at near 60 sites that day. What are some of the things that our volunteers are looking for? In terms of pipeline, this was the Stonewall Gathering pipeline in the middle of the state. They had lots of problems. Here was one of them that's probably hard to see, but it's a pretty large landslide that was, dumping sediment into the stream below. Some of, we're doing the in-stream sampling. We're also doing kind of this visual reconnaissance and training our volunteers to understand best management practices in terms of erosion and sediment control and what to look for in terms of making sure that those are doing their job and not failing. And here's an example of when they do fail. If you can, what this is sediment flowing from one stream flowing into a clear stream, and this was from the Rover pipeline earlier this year, which led into numerous water quality violations and finally DEP shutting them down temporarily to correct those. Because again, those best management practices that were put forth were not working and were not meeting their requirements under the permit. And that's one thing I would put forth in terms of minimizing environmental impacts. We rely heavily on permits being effective. And the more specific we see permits are able to be and are implemented, the better. And here are some aspects in terms of pipelines where we're promoting the idea of more specific, site-specific requirements. Karst areas where you have the cave systems and you're getting into some tricky situations. Certainly with these pipelines going through our mountainous areas, we're talking about steep slopes and there are different soil types. Some are more highly erodible than others. Something to consider. Stream crossings. Every stream is different and its banks are different. Between the MVP and ACP, we're talking about 1,300 1,300 stream crossings combined in West Virginia alone. They go into other states as well. That's a lot of crossings. That's a lot of water that at risk for some of this sedimentation that you saw a picture of. Another thing that the water crisis in Charleston brought our attention to are source water protection areas. These are where you have either a groundwater recharge zone or you're in a certain proximity to a drinking water intake where we want to be extra careful. There was actually a pipeline right away and right over the border from Monroe County, the Celanese pipeline, where a diesel spill, and this was in the right-of-way where it was cleared, sunk into a sinkhole and ended up contaminated the drinking water supply for the town of Petersburg, West Virginia, and they had to ship in other water for 2 weeks while they dealt with that problem, which many of you know, groundwater can be very complicated and very tricky, and there's a lot we don't know about how groundwater in our karst systems travel. Critical habitat, mentioned the trout work we're doing and others, and then this anti-degradation piece. There in our state law, we have to assure that these projects do not degrade water to some degree, 15%, and it gets complicated because our streams are classified differently. But our highest quality, the idea is that we're keeping our clean water clean, and our highest quality streams, we don't want to see any degradation of those streams, and that is our law, and that is why currently the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection withdrew their state permit or their 401 water quality certification for the Mountain Valley Pipeline to conduct a more thorough review around the anti-degradation standard. So I'm just going to give you one example of what we're currently looking at. We had the opportunity to take DEP personnel on a tour of the proposed ACP route. And this is in Pocahontas County. I know the map doesn't show you much but if I bring your attention to the red line and then the light green shading, that light green shading is karst topography. So this pipeline is going right through, this is one example. There are many others along on the several hundred mile route. This is where it crosses Big Springs, which is a trout stream. And they're proposing to blast through this area. And that's something we wanted to bring to DEP's attention, that blasting through karst can cause some perhaps unanticipated problems. So here's one place where we're looking for some more site-specific conditions. Another example, this is Clover Creek, also in Pocahontas County, also a karst area. And the pipeline, the ACP, is slated to come off of this mountain into this valley, and that's upstream. And here's downstream. It's set to cross right downstream. And this pool here, and this was like great timing. The trout were listening or something because we walked up on this low water bridge with DEP folks, and this is an undocumented trout stream. We walk up there's a bunch of trout. Like, okay, you guys can't deny this is not a trout stream. So they sent DNR out there, they did electrofishing, they did a survey there, and lo and behold, a lot of native trout, and this pool is like a nursery, trout nursery. So again, there's so much we don't know about our rivers and streams. We have 40,000 miles of them. And these projects, they take a lot of time and information gathering to get it right. You may have heard that a week ago, last Friday night at 7:10, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission certified both the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and the Mountain Valley Pipeline in a non-public meeting. But there was a dissension, and this is Cheryl LaFleur. She is the chair of FERC, and she dissented. The recent 2 Trump appointees voted yes, and she voted no. And what she cited, I think, is very instructive for the topic of this panel, is that she questioned approving both of these pipelines because they were so similar in terms of the proximity of their routes, the cumulative impact because they were in the same region and affecting the same watersheds, and the timing that the construction is likely to happen simultaneously. So that kind of compounds the issue around cumulative impacts in terms of the risk that construction poses. The FERC also instructed their staff to look at alternatives. That's part of their charge. And they did this research around this merge systems alternative and found that, yes, there is an alternative. It would indeed serve the capacity of both projects. The merge systems alternative would have increased co-location. So I think that's an important piece to take away from this, is are there ways when we're looking at infrastructure and pipelines, can we co-locate them with existing right-of-ways versus disturbing new land and new watershed? The alternative would have avoided national forest and would have reduced the number of crossings on the Appalachian Trail, Blue Ridge Parkway. It would have reduced the amount of construction in karst, and also would have reduced the total project length in 173 miles, of course, reducing land disturbance and impact on streams. The other thing, and I'll just say the reason, it's like, why didn't that happen? The companies made a strong argument that to go to an alternative would have delayed the project significantly. So that was the justification for going ahead with both projects from the other two FERC commissioners. Now thank you. What Chairwoman LaFleur also challenged FERC in her dissenting opinion was that brought up this question of need, and I believe FERC will probably get a legal challenge on this, is there demand, is there need for both of these projects? And she said when you consider the aggregate environmental impacts and when you consider these environmentally superior alternatives, that needs to be discussed. And she felt like the topic of need was underrepresented in this deliberation around these pipelines. So this is my last slide that kind of shows the reality we're living in, and West Virginia being so dependent on fossil fuel extraction in terms of our economy. We are an energy producing state. It comes at a cost. We also have great pride in the scenic beauty of our state, and the people who live here, who want to see their kids want to stay. And so, it's interesting. I think we're at a really interesting point in our state's history of talking about things like drinking water security and economic development and taking advantage of the scenic beauty and natural amenities that the state has in terms of tourism, visitation, and other things. But we also, I think, from my perspective and spending a lot of time at the state capitol, something I haven't touched on, but I think is a serious issue when we look at the drill fracking and the pipelines being built and the storage hub. We're talking about a lot more drilling. We're talking about a lot more waste, toxic waste. And I have seen in terms of our policymakers, no thought to long-term planning of how to deal with the volume of waste that we're talking about producing. Where is it going to go? And right now it's going into our commercial landfills. We're watching Antero, who's building a nearly 500-acre landfill for byproducts from wastewater recycling. A whole new technology coming to West Virginia and first of its kind. So a lot to think about here. I look forward to the further discussion. Thanks for your attention.
morning. Oh, wrong one. Right one. How do I get it so it's just the, oh, never mind. They don't need the notes. No? Oh, yeah, okay. Perfect. Good morning. I'm Susan LeGros. I'm the executive director of an organization called the Center for Responsible Shale Development. It's a nonprofit that's based in Pittsburgh. And the purpose of the organization was to bring together the diverse points of view from the environmental community and the gas extraction industry to find ways of that they could work together toward a better standard for operations by shale gas producers. I'm very pleased to be up here on a panel with people like Todd and Angie, who are who individually and with their organizations represent the best of civil society in terms of trying to be a voice for what is best for all of us. And what I want to talk about today is another attempt at the best of civil society, and particularly the role of voluntary standards, voluntary industry standards, and third-party certification to achieve many of those goals. As I indicated, the mission of our organization is to bring together these diverse points of view to ensure that where shale gas development takes place, it is done to the highest environmental and community standards. You'll note that we do not take a political position. As a nonprofit, we don't lobby or advocate specific legislative or regulatory positions other than those that are intended to advance the common welfare. The genesis of the organization came out of the very early shale gas boom, particularly in Pennsylvania. A gentleman named John Hanger, who was at one point the Secretary of the Department of Environmental Protection in Pennsylvania, was in that seat at the time when the controversy over the water quality in Dimock, Pennsylvania, hit the public news waves. And I'm sure many of you remember the issues about the flaming water, the water coming out of the kitchen tap that could be set afire. And having seen and lived with these experiences of dramatically different points of view about what the problem was and what needed to be done. Upon leaving his office, he brought together the initial group of companies and environmentalists and other civic leaders to say, aren't there areas where we can find agreement? And let's try to do that. And it is, and the organization that we have now is small, but I think it's significant. We have some very large extraction and production companies operating in the Appalachian Basin, and the scope of our activities includes the Appalachian Basin. So obviously we have a couple of international companies, Chevron and Shell, as well as some very significant regional players, EQT and Consol. And with EQT's purchase of the Rice Energy assets, EQT will become the owner of the largest number of extraction wells in the Appalachian Basin. We also have some significant environmental groups, the Environmental Defense Fund, which works internationally along with the Clean Air Task Force, and the Pennsylvania Environmental Council. And we try to work regularly with other environmental and industry groups as well. We've worked with the Nature Conservancy, Resources for the Future, and other shale gas producers to try to identify what needs to be done and how do we go forward. the slides that I have are probably more than we can go through, but I wanted you to have them for future reference if you're interested in pursuing this conversation. But I think the important thing here is when you think about what this organization tries to achieve, our view is that the best interests of society as a whole is enhanced by collaboration. I think that's really important in today's world where there are so many strongly held points of view and less tolerance for individuals who have a different point of view. But we really think that society is bettered by the willingness to work together and collaborate. I think we also are guided by the notion that industry needs to demonstrate leadership by practicing the highest level of environmental responsibility. And it is the role of environmentalists and the community at large to insist that that level of responsibility to be met. So the charge to groups like Angie's and Todd's is to point out the need and insist that the industry community live up to the standards required. And just to give you an example of the attempt to balance the inputs into this organization, we have a balanced board that includes leaders of industry, leaders of the environmental community, and also some individuals who have manifested a commitment to environmental issues but are not necessarily aligned with either. So we have individuals from academia, we have a toxicologist who has spent his life in public health, and various civic leaders who understand government and collaboration. The organization is built on other organizations that have shown that adoption of voluntary industry standards can lead to a higher level of performance. When the Center for Responsible Shale Development was founded, again, back in late part of 2008 and going up to 2011, most state regulatory formats were geared toward conventional drilling and were woefully out of date when you started talking about the issues that were presented by unconventional drilling. So one of the goals in setting up this organization, particularly for the environmental participants, was to identify a template of standards that could be used by states who were involved in the activity of trying to raise their standards. What ought your state regulatory programs look like if you were aiming toward the highest standards? I would say one of the motivators for the industry participants was an acknowledgement that the state regulations were behind the ball in terms of addressing the issues associated with shale gas development, and the need to build some confidence that there were ways that industry could go forward and regulate itself in some ways by adopting a much more stringent set of standards and then living up to them. So again, modeling on some of the other initiatives, particularly the Forest Stewardship Council, and then other things like the Green Building Initiative and the Marine Stewardship Council, this group adopted a template of 15 standards intended to address issues relating to water and air and climate. Those seem to be the primary drivers at that point in time. I think as time has gone on, we are currently in a status where we recognize that there are other issues that need to be addressed, and that some of those issues are not necessarily ones that can or perhaps even should be addressed by legislation and regulation, but are best addressed by civil society. Some of those issues, I would say, are ones like planning and siting of facilities. It's very, very difficult for states to come up with a uniform, comprehensive kind of land use development plan for oil and gas and they fear what could happen if they did that just for one industry. So recognizing the complexity of that issue probably exceeds the ability of regulation, other than perhaps you could get some very basic baseline kinds of regulations. But here again, there are many areas where by pooling information, the environmental community and the industries can come up with a toolbox of actions that can be taken that would avoid, minimize, and mitigate the impacts of development, and particularly when you start talking about the cumulative impacts that Angie was mentioning. And that is a perfect area for that kind of discourse and collaboration to take place, free from the high-pitched decibels that surround so many issues when you talk about gas development. Basically, the model is one of continuous improvement. Identify what needs to be done, look at the science, convene the stakeholders, come up with a best practice that we publish. And then I think most importantly and somewhat uniquely for this organization, we run a certification program. It is a voluntary program. Any operator in the Appalachian Basin can apply for certification, but they must be able to demonstrate to our independent third-party auditors that they meet across the basin at all their operations the 15 performance standards that have been set forth. This is not an easy bar. And we have had many companies that we've talked with, particularly smaller ones, who have expressed the concern that it is not an easy bar and that it is an all or nothing kind of bar. And in fact, they've advocated some kind of structure more akin to what the LEED and green building structure is, where you have levels of performance. And that is obviously something that we intend to be looking into. But it's very interesting because, again, many of the folks who have been involved in this initiative from the outset have said, no, the idea of standards is you're going to perform better than with the minimal requirements of state law, and therefore we ought not water them down in any way. I'm also happy to say that at this time, most state regulations have actually been enhanced and improved to deal with shale gas development, so that as it now stands, certain of our standards are more stringent continue to be more stringent than what states require. But at the same time, many state standards are at least as stringent as what ours, their regulatory requirements are very similar to what we have promulgated as voluntary standards. Just to give you an idea, I won't go through these individually, but to give you an idea of the standards we're talking about, this is the initial suite of water standards that were adopted. And so you'll see that since 2013, we have required that there be zero discharge of wastewater. Although we have, not too long ago, adopted a wastewater standard that would allow treatment, but only at facilities that perform the highest level of treatment that essentially meets best available technology. We require water recycling, no pits on well pads, but double-lined impoundments. And as I say, we've been requiring this since 2013, and the companies that have been certified can meet these standards at every one of their facilities across the basin. From the air standpoint, we have required a number of actions of existing facilities that are contained in the federal new source performance standards and would apply only to new facilities. But we require, again, that for certain types of compressor engines, et cetera, that, and certainly for completions, that the requirements of the new source performance standards be met, again, across the basin. Now, you might say, well, why would people participate in this? I think there are a number of reasons. Certainly for the environmental community, it's it's a seat at the table. Now, again, the environmental groups that have chosen to work with us have faced a great deal of criticism for essentially consorting with the enemy, I think, in some people's view. But they have brought, again, this insistence on the highest level of performance and a rigorous, I guess, cross-examination of the industry of why can't you do that? Don't you have this data? Why can't we do that? Can we find a way to do that? And that's a tremendously important process to engage in. For the operators, again, I think it is a recognition by those who have a long-term view that we're going to be involved in this industry for a long period of time, and we all must coexist, that it is important on a continuous basis to be evaluating how they are performing and what can be done to perform at a higher level. And this has become particularly evident in issues dealing with communities. The operators we've worked with have all told me, and many that we haven't worked with, have told me that the vast majority of their time is spent dealing with community issues. And perhaps that's rightly so, because these are so imminent for the people who are affected. And it's absolutely important, if this industry is going to proceed at any level, that it accommodate the interests of the communities. I want to point out, too, for those of you who are interested, that there are a number of resources available if you are interested in learning about what are the best approaches to manage and mitigate the emissions and the impacts associated with shale gas development. Obviously, a significant issue at this time is the impact of pipelines. And in fact, I would say the public attention has shifted from concerns about casings, et cetera, with the extraction and production industry to the impact of the pipelines. And so there are a couple groups, the Natural Gas Supply Collaborative and the Downstream Natural Gas Initiative, that have come together. These are primarily purchasers of natural gas, merchant power plants and power companies, power distribution companies that are looking at the value chain from starting with operation and production all the way down to the consumer to say, you know, we need to address this as a holistic issue and make sure that at each step we are managing the environmental impacts and consequences appropriately. And I think this is a great step. I do think this is perhaps overdue. I also want to point out that in early 2016, the governor of Pennsylvania, Tom Wolf, convened a task group to work on what are we going to do about pipelines. And he put together a task force of about 48 people, people from across the spectrum, including probably, I suspect someone from the Nature Conservancy was on that task force. Do you know, Thomas? Yeah, people from each of the environmental groups involved with us, as well as people from industry. They had something like 100 volunteers who helped amass the data and the information, and they came up with 184 recommendations, some for government, actions that government needed to do, some for civil society, some for industry, et cetera. But that serves as a real reference, I think, for the kinds of issues that and the approaches that would be valuable in terms of dealing with infrastructure development. Most of these have not been acted upon, sadly. If you know anything about Pennsylvania politics, you know the explanation for that. A couple of different approaches, too, that I would recommend that folks look into. One is the state review of oil and natural gas environmental regulations, an organization called Stronger. Basically, this is made up of state environmental and pipeline regulatory agencies, and it is a compendium of how different states across the country who are dealing with oil and gas issues are regulating different kinds of issues. And so again, it's a tremendous reference point for anyone who is looking to say, what are the best practices? How can we implement them? Who's doing what? And then finally, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB. I don't think it's well known in our area, but it's based in California and has quite a broad reach. They have adopted sustainability standards for, I think, 93 industries, and they have some standards that are specifically geared to oil and gas production and extraction, as well as to pipelines and distribution. And they are quite comprehensive and tremendously informative. So this kind of voluntary collaborative approach has been identified and complemented in a number of different forums. Certainly the National Governors Association, and I want to point out the Investor Environmental Health Network, which works with some in the investment community and puts out an annual ranking of extraction and production companies in which they evaluate their practices and their transparency and disclosure on various other criteria, and ranks them as, and then provides an explanation for their ranking. So I think that's very valuable to communities and to landowners, et cetera, in terms of who's doing well, who's not doing so well, what do we need to ask of them. And then finally, I would say the Boston Consulting Group and Harvard University conducted a study about 2 years ago, essentially identifying the shale gas as a sort of a golden egg for the United States economy if it can be done properly. And that was the significant caveat on their findings, that can it be done in a responsible way? And in fact, it must be done in a responsible way if it is going to yield the promise that it holds. And one of the things they did, unbeknownst to our organization, is they examined each of our 15 standards and what it cost a company to, on a per-site basis, to raise their standard from what the state regulations required to what we required. And they found that although it could be up to, depending on the level that the facility was at, it could be up to $400,000 for a well. However, when you compare that to the value that was going to be received from that well's production over its lifetime, it is a minimal fraction of the value of that well. And so we got an endorsement from them that, hey, this is a good way to proceed. So in any event, I think this, particularly in the times we're living in, it's critically important for folks to listen to others and to find ways to collaborate and to continue to work to go forward on whatever kinds of issues we see need to be addressed. Obviously, we've identified some of them: midstream construction, cumulative impacts, siting and planning, but there will be more. And I think that's one of the strengths of our society is individual activism and collective activism can yield results. Thank you.
Well, thanks to all of our speakers, and we'll have some cards coming around if you have questions that can be brought up here, and I'll share them. While those are going around and being collected, I have a hopefully relatively quick question for each of our panelists. So I'll start with Todd. You mentioned a couple of things that I'd like you to see if you could briefly explain. First, you talked about mitigation banking credits and what that means, and I was wondering if you could kind of briefly describe that for us. I know brief on that might not be so easy. And also, if you could talk a little bit about how many sites we're talking about that you'd like to be able to do, and what it would cost to do everything you'd like to do.
Golly. Okay, so mitigation banking, that'll take us through the lunch hour, but I'll try to make it quick. So under the Clean Water Act and rules that came out in 2008, companies, developers who have impacts on streams and wetlands are supposed to first avoid impacts, second, minimize impacts, third, mitigate for their impacts. And so there's a hierarchy for how impacts are supposed to be mitigated. The first is through mitigation banks, which are private entities that take private capital and restore streams and wetlands, and then sell credits to other entities that have impacts that, through the permitting process, need to mitigate for their impacts. So this is the preferred method of mitigation because essentially the restoration happens and credits are released before the impacts. So there's no time lag there between impact and mitigation. So a mitigation bank is a private entity that invests private capital to do restoration and then sell credits to entities that have impacts that they need to offset through the permitting process. And there's many steps. It's regulated, regulatory oversight, et cetera. Your second question, I wouldn't even know how to answer that. There is, we work on many different kinds of stream restoration. Some of it's for brook trout habitat with DNR. Some of it's for sediment load reductions with DEP. Some of it's mitigation. There's a long future of work in all of those. I know, and I would say it's a growing industry, and will probably keep growing with all of these impacts we're talking about today, as well as the roads bill that just passed, et cetera. All the consulting firms I know are hiring people who do this work and can't find enough of them, and are turning down work in the meantime. So I don't know how to answer what we could do, how much of it we could do, or what I'd want to do, but it'd be fun to keep doing.
Very good. Well, we have a lot of questions. I will try to get to them. Some of them are similar, and including the question I was going to ask Angie is on at least one of the cards, so that's synergies are good. You talked about enforcement and using permitting as part of that process, and one of the things I've seen in my research is we talk about passing new laws and increasing regulation, but if we're not enforcing existing ones, that doesn't mean a whole lot. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about maybe places that we're coming up short, or things that you've seen in enforcement, or maybe expand a little bit on the specificity that you mentioned that helps increase your ability to provide oversight.
That's right. You know, laws are only as strong as they are enforced. It's been challenging. I mean, we've been a part, other groups have been a part of citizen lawsuits under the Clean Water Act because the state has failed to enforce the law. And it's a resource question too. I was told about a month ago, when it looked like the writing was on the wall with these big pipelines. And these two pipelines are one of hundreds. These are big ones, but we have around 1,000 gathering line projects that have happened over the last year and a half. That our state DEP has a half dozen, 6 inspectors looking at pipeline construction activities. So the idea of these major projects getting started soon and not just having a handful of inspectors out there calls to our responsibility to mobilize what I described, our kind of citizen monitoring, because the regulators aren't out there. And Rover and Stonewall Jackson, those were citizen reports. And that's why I think organizations like ours are important to publicize what is happening and the response. And some of the frustration is when companies are given a notice of violation or a consent decree and the penalties are so low that it's not really a deterrent. And there are some good companies wanting to do the right thing, And there are some companies with really, really bad track records that, for whatever reason, are still allowed to operate in this state.
Thank you. So Susan, there's more than a few questions. Curious about kind of where your funding comes from, how things are designed, and where your standards match up with, for example, compared to federal methane proposals and those kinds of things. In addition to that, one thing I'd like to ask that's kind of a little more specific is that you focus on a particular region in this area. So like, for example, the 90% water recycling target. That obviously wouldn't work in a place, well, it would not likely to be met by any company in Oklahoma, for example. So the standards don't translate, at least immediately. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how specific those are to this region, and if there's a plan to, if anyone's going to look to make those across the board.
Well, I think your first question was about funding. We are funded actually by the participants, the environmental organizations and the companies. When the organization was set up, there was a great concern that although the companies should pay for some of this, that we did not want there to be any appearance that it was controlled in any way by the companies, and hence you see the board, and you have a requirement that any of our standards that are adopted have to be adapted unanimously by that board of 12 people, most of whom are not affiliated with industry. We also get funding from the foundations for various programs that we initiate. Your other question related to
The varying standards across
different
regions.
The original intent was to address issues unique to the Appalachian Basin. So obviously we have a lot of water resources, and so we recognize that in some areas like Oklahoma that you mentioned, that certain of our standards wouldn't apply. We have a no flaring requirement, and in North Dakota they're flaring away. But some of our standards were meant to recognize, one, what is possible here, and two, what the society here would require. I mean, what might be acceptable in Oklahoma or North Dakota is not acceptable to many people in this region. Our intent really was, and our hope was that other regions would adopt a similar model and come up with standards that are uniquely applicable to them. Now, having said that, certain of our standards certainly could be adopted anywhere. For instance, as I say, recycling might not work everywhere, but no idling, certain types of, particularly the air standards, certain types of compressors, they could be used anywhere if there is a will to do it.
Angie, there's a question, you talked about the wastewater recycling plant that's coming in. The question is what impacts that will have on mitigating harmful effects of shale gas development, and will the plant itself have potential impacts on the environment?
So I would answer that saying there's a lot of unknowns. We have not seen a plant of this scale in our region to date. And right now they're permitted to, once they treat the wastewater, to discharge that into surface water, a receiving stream. Something we did as this project developed and went through the permitting process is insist on monitoring, and we're still not happy. So we've appealed that permit because the monitoring requirements aren't as comprehensive as we think they need to be from a precautionary standpoint, and just knowing what we know in terms of what kind of pollutants could be involved in this wastewater. So it's something we're watching closely because it is so new, and there is let me just tell you the scale of this. The company says there will be 600 truckloads per day, 7 days a week, going in and out of this facility with waste. 600 per day, every day. So we're not just, I mean, we're not just talking about the facility, we're also talking about traffic, we're talking about emissions. We like the idea of recycling wastewater, but the sludge that will be a byproduct of this is radioactive, and they're saying now it's going to be trained out to Utah. But the byproduct of the salts are still going to be landfilled at this facility.
I'm going to try and combine a couple of these. For Todd, one of the questions is, why are the coal companies allowed to leave their sites in such bad shape? And in combination to that, I'd like you to answer that and fix it for us. And is there any effort moving forward with mining timber and other operations to try and prevent this impact so that we don't keep causing the same problems and learn from our mistakes?
Yeah, so those are good questions, and my expertise is limited to trying to fix a few things where I can. I think generally the coal mine reclamation has improved over the years. If you look at the site in the middle of my talk with all the gullies and stuff, that was before the big Surface Mine and Reclamation Act was passed in the 77 or whenever that was. And so you compare that with the impacts of the modern mountaintop mine, which are different, but the on-site impacts, well, I don't know, it's hard to compare because the scale of landscape movement has changed, but the way they left the site was certainly more stable. It would be a huge leap forward to also try to control and limit off-site impacts. I don't know why that boundary is what it is. It's pretty crazy. So that the mountaintop mine site we worked at, they're in the process of releasing their bonds and reclaiming the area. We've seen water quality improvements as that process has happened. A lot of those roads and ditches will be reclaimed up on the mountaintop, which will improve life where we are down in the valley below. So those are good things. There are many other impacts that are going to linger, including water quality, which we haven't really talked about. But what was the second part of your question, Jeff?
Just how we can do better moving forward.
Yeah. I mean, when we reclaim those sites, are we thinking about the way that landscape and those soils and those forests should be? That would put them back into our landscape and contribute to its resilience again. Are we thinking about how they produced clean water? There's a million ways to still improve that from an ecological standpoint, certainly.
Well, we are out of time, I'm afraid, and try and keep us and get us back on schedule. So sorry to those who I didn't get to your questions. There are some other good ones, but it's time to move on and thank our panelists for their presentations and their time.
So lunch will be in our event space. If you go out to the main hallway or the lobby, take a right, and it's the very first large room on the right. So we'll have lunch and our 2 lunchtime speakers immediately following lunch. Thank you.